Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Welcome to the day 2 of our symposium, International Perspectives on the Future of Architecture and Urbanism in the Post-COVID Age, the 4th International Symposium organized by the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative. I'm Mohammad Garipur.
And I'm Caitlin D. Clerk.
We are pleased to be joined by panelists and presenters from 21 countries and participants representing exactly 91 countries. Indeed, this is evidence of the ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the simultaneous crisis of institutionalized racism, economic and racial inequality, and climate change have left few corners of the globe untouched. Only a few days ago, we reached a devastating global milestone of 2 million deaths worldwide due to COVID-19. Yet the opportunity for us to convene together today and to work toward a healthier and more just post-COVID world is indeed an occasion for hope. As discussed in our previous conferences, long before the appearance of COVID-19, the urban fabric of cities across the world had been shaped by prior epidemics. Indeed, the study of historic global epidemics has illuminated the many ways in which the urban life and architecture have changed during times of pestilence. Undoubtedly, the cities, workplaces, schools, homes, and spaces of recreation we inhabit today will undergo changes large and small in the wake of COVID. And also, as we anticipate the inevitable next epidemic or pandemic. What might these changes look like? Or more to the point, what should they look like? In other words, how might we use this time of rebuilding and rethinking to re-envision, design, and inhabit cities that are more just and equitable? For example, how might we reduce our collective carbon footprints and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How might we bring more voices into the process of design? How might we recenter health in all design practices and processes?
In this two-day symposium, scholars and practitioners from 21 countries confront these questions and present case studies of the impacts of this pandemic on a range of spatial contexts and practices, and in so doing, help us imagine new possibilities for a post-COVID urban landscape. Yesterday's topics included response and experience, ecology and sustainability, and education and pedagogy. And today's topics will include design and interventions, healthcare design, and social justice and equity. Today's session is being live streamed to the Epidemic Urbanism YouTube channel, and recordings of all sessions will be publicly available on the YouTube channel as well. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get updates on this content as it becomes available. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the contributions of our speakers who worked really hard over the holidays, who are joining us from across the world, as well as those of our wonderful panel chairs. And we also want to thank all participants who are joining us as well from many countries across the world. We also want to thank the AIA Design and Health Research Consortium for their support of this virtual conference. Each of the 3 sessions today will last 1 hour. In each session, after a brief introduction, you will hear 4 to 5 papers. The session moderator will respond with their comments, and then we'll open the session for Q&A. We invite you all to ask any questions you have in the Q&A box here in Zoom, or for those of you watching on YouTube, you can type questions into the live chat space. Please note that we may not be able to answer all questions. Indeed, we got many more questions yesterday than we were able to answer live, but do know that all questions will be saved and shared with presenters to guide future work. So we really do appreciate your questions and your comments. So now let us begin. Our first session today is design and interventions. Papers in this session will address a range of design interventions as well as implications for the design profession more broadly, including questions of how and where the work of design and construction currently happens, who and what it serves, and how the systems of recognition for architectural practice can and should be rethought. As with the response to other urban and public health crises, the design profession has been called upon to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. This has led to innovative design solutions to accommodate new cultural and social practices, yet also has put into stark relief the inadequacies of many urban design, housing, and workplace solutions that previously felt routine. Through this critical lens, the presentations in this session will explore the design, implementation, and experience of design and construction interventions to cope with COVID-19 and its impacts, the future of design technologies, construction practices, and of architectural practice, and short and long-term impacts of social distancing and teleworking on urban development and architectural design. Dr. Luisa Urochi will be moderating this session. Dr. Urochi is an associate professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington in Seattle. She's a licensed architect who has worked in architectural firms in Toronto, New York, and Cambridge. She's the author of The Urban Department Store in America from Ashgate in 2014, and editor of Visual Merchandising, The Image of Selling from Ashgate in 2013. Her research focuses on the forms and operations of the material artifacts of the city with a focus on commerce, storage, and health.
Hello, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Caitlin and Mohammed for inviting me to be part of this important event. This morning's session on design and intervention includes 4 papers from speakers from 4 countries from diverse perspectives. So I'm very excited and anxious to get started. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Walder. She is a visiting lecturer in architecture at the Wales Institute of Science and Art at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. She obtained her PhD in architecture from the University of Liverpool School of Architecture. Her publications focus mainly on recognition within the architectural profession and issues surrounding gender. In March 2020, she contributed to an online international ebook entitled Surviving the Coronavirus Lockdown and Social Isolation. Her paper today is entitled The Fall of Starchitecture and the Future of Architectural Practice in the Post-COVID UK.
The arrival and impact of COVID in the UK has necessitated the rethinking of the workplace for the architecture studio with reference to both the creative mind and the practical delivery of design. In addition, COVID has impacted the recognition system within the UK, and in doing so, I believe has woken up the establishment to understand that the time for change is now. Tomorrow will be too late. Within the architectural profession, we have this phenomenon, starchitecture or star architecture, architects at the top end who are predominantly white and male. Ask any student of architecture who they are influenced by, and they will name Corbusier, Mies, or Frank Lloyd Wright, all white, all male. Architecture may once have been seen as an elite profession, but it is now possible to challenge the status quo. For example, it took 6 years between electing the first female president of the RIBA for a female to win their highest accolade, the Royal Gold Medal. With other activists, I have spent the last few years pushing for a successful increase in female nominations for the International Architecture Prizes, resulting in wins for O'Donnell and Toomey in 2015, Zaha Hadid in 2016, and Grafton Architects last year. I think we are now in a similar situation with non-white architects. We currently sit within a radically aware society where controversy and anti-establishment are bedfellows. But international campaigns such as Black Lives Matter will eventually filter down to the architectural profession. Few non-white architects have been recognised, but in a future of professional change, anything is possible. In its 170-year history, the oldest architectural prize, the RIBA Royal Gold Medal, has only ever been awarded to 2 non-white individuals, and one of them is for this year, 2021. But in this period of turbulence, I question if we are giving the gold medals to the right people. David Adjaye did top the list of the UK's most influential black people in 2012, but his practice has been close to insolvency. Surely we should be recognising the achievements of someone like Mariam Kamara instead. a question to certainly think about. There is no doubt that the winds of change are blowing for recognition in the field. More women are being nominated, and I urge my fellow speakers and this audience to nominate younger and more non-white architects as well. Within practice, architects have been working hard to embrace the technology revolution. Large open plan design studios delivered complex projects using BIM, allowing us to work with our multidisciplinary colleagues. And small practices also adopted technologies such as WhatsApp as a project management tool. But then along came COVID. Overnight, teams became individuals and created their own home office, like mine in the 3rd bedroom, a tiny space under the stairs or in the shed at the bottom of the garden. We now use online meeting hubs to transfer knowledge and exchange best practice. And despite Norman Foster commenting that there is no substitute for face-to-face contact around a table, many practices are questioning whether their existing workspace will continue to be necessary. Ian Harris, the managing director of Mavima, a large UK practice with 5 offices, anticipates that staff will operate on a 50-50 split between working from home and in the office in the longer term. Harris points out that with long-term leases already signed, making the spaces work in terms of rent may well mean inviting others to share it with us. Architects are in many ways traditionalists, trusting in what they know to work. Some practices can find it hard to react beyond the established routes of procurement, but those who are flexible enough to tip their toes into new market areas will quickly steal a march on the competition who are busy looking the other way. Darnton B3 Architecture, previously the house architect for Coca-Cola and Adidas in the UK, are now developing Home and Maker, an offshoot company that designs one-off and house extensions. The future of practice is to be flexible and versatile. This year in the UK, the project focus shifted onto unusual housing buildings, clever civic projects and small-scale structures such as these. Recognising that no significant new buildings were being designed, most architectural awards were cancelled. This is not the first time in history that cities and buildings will be redesigned in response to an increased understanding of disease. COVID-19 is speeding up development of all types of touchless technology, like automatic doors and hands-free light switches and temperature controls. Self-cleaning bathrooms could be the future for hotel design, as well as antibacterial fabrics and finishes being commonplace. The typical 3-bedroom house in the UK will be replaced by a 2-bedroom house and a dedicated home office space. Open plan living will be carved up into individual spaces, and as more people will be working from home, there will be a wider preoccupation with thermal comfort and energy efficiency. Architecture in the 21st century is now about raising awareness of climate change, rather than celebrating new materials or expanding the envelope of design. I want to leave you with this quote from Rami El-Samahi, a principal at Over Under in Boston. We need to embrace these dramatic changes taking place within the profession. Virtual working will fundamentally change the value proposition of shared workspace. Working alongside others, but not in the same physical space, will allow for a future balance of isolated concentration and productive, meaningful collaboration. We will be the same, but our approach must be different. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Our next speaker is brilliant Mavima, who is a PhD student at the University of Zimbabwe. His focus is in urban design, planning systems, and computer-aided designing and modeling. He has been involved in various design and modeling projects for different local authorities and private organizations in Zimbabwe. He is a teaching assistant at the University of Zimbabwe in the Department of Architecture and Real Estate. Brilliant's paper this morning is entitled Urban Design and Public Transport in the Age of Pandemics in Harare, Zimbabwe.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So my presentation will focus on the impacts of COVID-19 with a specific focus on transportation and urban design. So Zimbabwe, like any other country, has been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, having recorded 17,194 cases and 418 people dying. COVID-19 has also led to other aspects like the lockdown of every activity, leading to informal markets being closed down due to this pandemic. This includes the economy generally, because Zimbabwe's economy is around 80% informal, and with it, the informal transportation system. During this time, 72% of Zimbabwe's population has also lost its jobs and now living under the poverty line. And because of this, you look at Harare, how it was planned. It was planned following the separatist planning ideologies by the colonial masters, which led to the development of single-use zones that were meant to separate blacks from whites and various other uses. So the development and the planning of these settlements following these single-use zones, it's led to the development of urban sprawl. Because when the cities, when Harare was planned, it was planned for a population that was controlled, which was around 300,000. But the coming of independence meant that population would bulge, and to date, Harare is around 1.4 million people in terms of, that's according to the Zimbabwe statistics 2012. So as Harare was growing in terms of population, it started expanding its boundaries continuously. And this happened against a situation where Harare and Zimbabwe in general is a single transport option. The other option that exists, the railway transport option, but it's already dead, so it cannot really be considered in terms of transportation in Zimbabwe. On the other hand, the government has been trying to emphasize on the concept of densification, with their recommendation master plan emphasizing on densification, but not giving a straight position as to how to densify. So this whole idea of urban sprawl has been backed by informal transportation system, which came in around 1992 when the Economic Structure Adjustment programs recommended that the government should stop funding the formal transportation system that existed by then. So the coming of COVID and the banning of the informal transport system from moving led to the reintroduction of ZUPCO. But the informal transport network has also continued to masquerade within the cities. If you look to your right, there is a combi that is really guarded by, I don't know what those are, but it really is a fortress that is guarded against the Zimbabwe Republic Police, because they are now violating the COVID rules. The idea of violating the COVID rules now comes from the issue that there is insufficient public transport, because the coming of ZUPCO was a makeshift decision that was made because the government was trying to stop informality, at the same time trying to create an option for people. So this did not take into cognizance the existence of insufficient transport network. So if you look at that, that's the central business district of Harare. The bus terminal is called Copacabana, where the people are always in large queues and not being able to maintain the social distancing, thereby increasing the chance of one contracting COVID-19. At the same time, the issue of informal public transport system that we've shown in the previous slide is also led to a cat and mouse relationship between the police, thereby leading to some fatalities. For example, people dying. If you look to the right, there's a case where the police are accused of hitting a very young baby at an informal transport rank. So in conclusion, what we're saying is that the design standards in Zimbabwe have reduced the diversity in terms of transport options, whereby you do not have much options with regards to the transport options. Furthermore, the planning policies that were designed are still that are used to design, or that were used in Harare, are still under enforcement. As such, you see that the policy frameworks still operate under the colonial ideology of separatism. As such, the single-use zones are continued to be delivered in Zimbabwe. This now needs, or Harare now needs a set of planning standards that can add transportation options. When one is coming up with a development proposal, one should be able to provide various options without really depending on the road network, which is not really supported by any funding at the moment. Furthermore, the idea of densification that was brought as an option really needs to be placed as part of regeneration in the areas around Harare. For example, in the single use zone where we have, for example, a commercial center, where we have a central business district of Harare, there are a huge number of void levels, but these cannot be added into residential or any other use to reduce the rate of sprawl, because the existing policy framework do not permit for the continuous changing of the uses. As such, there is need for the concept of densification to be engraved into the idea of regeneration, thereby reducing the rate in which the cities are sprawling, and now adding various other uses in different places. For example, we have a component of residential within a central business district, where you say maybe at the 3rd floor we now have a residential up to the 9th floor, or we have some component of residential within industrial, where we create an industrial park, but then you choose the various other uses that are compatible, or use industrial uses that are not very dangerous to the people. So basically that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, brilliant. Our third speaker is Robinson Mikhail, who is an art history student at Johannes Gutenberg University and works as a construction manager at the architectural firm for Senkrick and Mons, Germany. He obtained a bachelor's degree in architectural heritage at the University of Applied Sciences, Rhein-Main in Wiesbaden, Germany. He is mainly concerned with the preservation and development of cultural heritage and modern and contemporary architecture. Robinson's paper today is entitled Envisioning a Post-COVID Hybrid Work Housing Solution in an Architectural Studio in Berlin, Germany.
At the beginning of the crisis, the German government adopted various hygiene measures, including teleworking, homeschooling, and social distancing to reduce the risk of infections in Germany. Digitalization is driving the trend towards working from home. The result of these measures is that people spend significantly more time at home and leave their apartments less frequently. This means that people perceive the surroundings differently, so the rooms and areas in their apartments are redefined. When several people live in one apartment and work there at the same time, various problems arise. There is no private retreat for the individual, therefore it is difficult to work calmly and concentrated. In addition, common areas such as the kitchen and the living room are not designed for this situation. Bringing work into people's homes presupposes a new usage requirement. On the one hand, working, housing, and leisure cannot be separated anymore. Instead of big offices and small apartments, bigger apartments need built to ensure enough space for all utilization units. On the other hand, the room structure inside the apartments must be reconsidered. A bed that is not used 16 hours a day doesn't need an own room. Otherwise, the kitchen, the center of living together, and other common rooms need to be redesigned. But architecture slept through this problem in the past few years. A hybrid solution of working and housing is Ark Plus Space in Berlin, Germany. Open floor plans and open room configurations enable the union of living and working on only 250 square meters. Ark Plus is an architecture magazine whose publisher is based in Berlin. The Ark Plus Space has an almost square floor plan. This in turn is divided into 9 rectangular rooms of almost the same size, so that a 3x3 grid is created. The walls are partially movable, and each room has at least 2 entrances. This principle enables flexible organization of the rooms, and individual areas can be temporarily separated or switched on. In this way, private, work, and public space can be accommodated in one and the same apartment and can be enlarged or reduced in case it is needed. The old principle of modern architecture that working and living must be strictly separated from each other is overcome. Ark Plus has developed an alternative form of housing and working in cooperation with Arno Löwicke. This project was realized and opened in 2018. This solution has numerous advantages. Firstly, the valuable living space is used with maximum efficiency. Secondly, unnecessary mobility is avoided due to the elimination of commuting, which improves the environmental balance of both residents and the city. Thirdly, this solution enables a better work-life balance. Long commutes are no longer necessary, and more flexible working hours enrich family life. The Ark Plus Space is an office of 10 employees, an event location and a family's habitation at the same time. That means a family lives there, but during the day, residential use is reduced, and some of the private spaces change their use and become a workspace or a public space. The blending of work and home in a single unit is special and innovative about this concept. Also, furniture can disappear into the walls or fulfill several functions. For example, a bed can be folded into the wall, so the bedroom can also be used as a place of retreat or a music room during the day. After COVID, larger events can also take place in the apartment. Several rooms can be interconnected for this purpose. The concept offers the possibility of social distancing as well, as certain rooms can be isolated, so it is possible to separate individuals from each other. Ark Plus Space has not developed because of COVID, rather it tries to solve general problems of our time. But the pandemic has accelerated these developments and revealed the urgency of measures like these. Ark Plus Space unites community and privacy and offers the opportunity to bring working and housing together efficiently and sustainably in an overall solution. The combination of open rooms and modular furniture make the design unique. This concept can also be transferred to other utilizations. For example, a family living in a small apartment. In this case, bedrooms can be transformed into offices by day, and common spaces like the kitchen or the dining room can be interconnected or varied in their size. That makes it easier to combine family and work, and the residents save resources and money. Making ideas like this suitable for the masses and developing them further will be one of the major tasks of the architecture firms of the future. Only in this way, living in the city will become sustainable and affordable, and only in this way, cities will be crisis-proof. Thank you for the attention. At the beginning of
Thank you, Robinson. In our final paper, we have 3 authors. Babak Mamariam is Director of Exposure Control Technologies Research at CPWR, the Center for Construction Research in Maryland, USA. He earned a PhD in construction management from Arizona State University in the US. He is also a certified safety professional, or CSP. His research interest involves occupational safety and health with a focus on site safety, climate improvement, prevention thorough design, and pre-task planning. His co-author, Sarah Brooks, is an industrial hygienist at CPWR, the Center for Construction Research and Training. She obtained a master's in public health with a concentration in environmental occupational health from the University of Pittsburgh in USA. She currently manages an online database of occupational exposure measurements. The paper by Babak Mariam, Sarah Brooks, and Christopher Lee is entitled Sustaining Safe Construction Operations in the US During COVID-19.
In occupational safety and health, the first step in preventing accidents and injuries is to identify hazards and then assess their magnitude and potential impacts. Whether they are fall hazards, struck by tools or vehicles, trip, slip, or anything else. Once the hazard is identified and assessed, using the hierarchy of controls, we decide how to address the situation. As shown on this slide, the priority is always given to the physical elimination of the hazard. At this step, architects and structural engineers in collaboration with construction practitioners can play a critical role to produce alternative designs to eliminate or minimize the exposure to hazards. If hazard elimination is not feasible, then we consider other options. However, it should be noted that personal protective equipment known as PPE is considered as the last line of defense in preventing work-related accidents and injuries. This study is part of a larger CPWR project that focuses on pre-task planning in construction. In construction projects, pre-task planning is a major step where contractors try to allocate resources needed to successfully deliver each portion of the work. Identifying and addressing safety hazards and providing necessary resources to protect workers is also an important step in pre-task planning. So in this study, we try to explore contractor challenges and preventive practices they employ to sustain construction operations while keeping workers safe during the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. To this end, we conducted 23 video and phone interviews with construction practitioners representing 18 companies in the US. These companies range from small local subcontractors to large level general contractors. We grouped our findings into two major categories: challenges and preventive practices. Constantly changing and sometimes vague guidelines and protocols during the pandemic have been a major challenge for essential industries like construction, which are supposed to continue their operations during the pandemic. Here are a few challenges to name based on our findings. On construction job sites, there are usually more than one contractor working on the same project or same area. We found that there have been disagreements and inconsistency between contractors in applying preventive practices as they use different approaches. Also, contractors have to follow different protocols when they work on different types of projects. For instance, safety and health measures that they have to follow on healthcare projects like hospitals are different compared to a commercial building project. More challenging is that some COVID guidelines contradict with existing occupational safety practices and standards. A simple example is 6-foot distancing. Based on existing safety standards, workers are not allowed to do heavy lifts by themselves. But at the same time, they have to follow 6-foot social distancing rule. Therefore, they do it individually, which raises other health and safety risks. Productivity loss due to lack of workforce as the result of quarantine and infected workforce is another issue. Moreover, the material supply from epicenters for some special items has significantly slowed down or completely stopped some construction operations. To overcome this unforeseen situation and continue operations, contractors have employed some interventions and preventive measures. So let's look at some of these preventive practices we learned in our study. Using a smaller work crews, for example, 2 crews of 5 workers instead of a big crew of 10, and staggering launch times and break times have been some effective control measures to reduce workers' exposure and the spread of virus. Enhancing job hazard analysis documents that are used before starting each task with new line items for COVID-19 to repeatedly inform workers about the hazard and available controls is another effective approach. Also, using electronic forms instead of paper copies and pictures instead of signatures to reduce touch are some other good practices. In addition to basic site sanitation measures like installing additional hand washing stations, some contractors have removed high-touch surfaces like job site turnstile, which has been a pretty clever idea. Carpooling to job site is a very common practice among construction workers, which is not recommended during the pandemic. So as a financial incentive, some contractors have offered per diems to encourage workers to avoid carpooling. And to enhance situational awareness on job sites, posting signage and banners in high traffic areas has been strongly recommended. As we have learned, due to the nature of construction projects, construction workers are constantly at high risk of exposure to several safety and health hazards. And situations like COVID-19 increase these workers' vulnerability. Therefore, it is critical to implement effective safety and health controls to protect these workers to continue essential construction operations. And also at the organizational level, the success of production systems depends on their resiliency in coping with unexpected circumstances like COVID. We believe these transdisciplinary practices that I briefly presented today are not only applicable to construction, but also across multiple industries and sectors with some modifications and adjustments. Thank you.
Thank you, Babak, and to your co-authors. And thank you to all the presenters for their thoughtful papers on the role of design and intervention. The coronavirus pandemic has changed everything. The scale of its impact on the world, from public health to the global economy, on media and society, is indisputable, and not the least of which is the impact on the built environment. In the past 10 months, almost everyone has to some degree become more aware of their physical surroundings, from our cities and streets to our bedrooms and closets. We have all become more attuned to how the spaces we inhabit can serve as both a refuge and a threat, as a part of a system of control and one of liberation. This conference has brought those of us who study, shape, and occupy the built environment together for 2 days to consider the current challenges and future strategies. As architects and historians, urban planners and construction managers, city dwellers and public citizens, we must reevaluate what we do and explore what it means to design for a world forever altered in a way that we cannot yet fully grasp. The 4 papers in this morning's session on design and intervention address this challenge from a wide variety of perspectives, but all with a focus on taking action. They investigate what it means not to just identify the immense challenges that face us in terms of the study and practice of urban planning and architecture, but to propose ways to move forward with optimism and energy. This is not the first, nor will it be the last time cities and buildings have had to be reimagined in response to a crisis that seems infinite in its duration and immeasurable in its scale. The panelists this morning have addressed the question of how not simply to just respond, but to lead by making plans and proposals, by building and intervening in a tangible way that can shape the future of the built environment for the better. Our panelists today have approached this question from a variety of perspectives. In her paper, Elizabeth Ward examines how this crisis has highlighted entrenched inequalities within the workplace of the architectural studio in the UK in relation to gender, class, and race. She notes that this time of turbulence offers an opportunity to upend established elitist practices that have privileged white male architects. The future of the architectural profession, she argues, is in its ability to be flexible and versatile, both in methods of practice and in more sustainable designs, from contactless bathrooms to innovative live-work solutions. In his paper, Robinson Mikhail argues that new restrictions caused by COVID and trends towards digitization provide an opportunity to innovate. He examines the case study of Ark Plus Space, a cooperative project in Berlin of 2018 that is designed to provide equitable and efficient spaces that can respond to blurring divisions between work and life. Robinson notes that the flexibility of this cooperative space to adapt to current needs of its residents for private and communal space have also had an impact on the city itself by helping to forge community and eliminating commuting. The impact of the pandemic on urban transportation is the focus of brilliant Mavimi's paper. He connects the crisis of the shortage of public transportation in this largest city in the country of Zimbabwe to the legacy of segregation and colonialist urban planning practices. The government ban on privately owned buses has exacerbated overcrowding at bus terminuses, exposing commuters to potential contagion and to violent clashes with police. He argues that only with improved planning standards that link multiple transportation options with urban densification and multi-use zoning will improve public safety. Improving occupational health and safety is the focus of the paper by Babak Mariam and his co-authors. The authors surveyed a range of construction firms to identify current practices to protect the health of construction workers who are a highly vulnerable and essential workforce. They call for a transdisciplinary approach to produce designs that can eliminate and minimize exposure to hazards, physical and social, and include management organization policies to educate crew members. Again, connecting back to the issue of transportation for essential workers in the post-COVID city. I would like to invite the panelists now to unmute and show their video so we can respond to the questions from the audience. Thank you so much, everyone. So our first question comes for Mavima, for Brilliant, my apologies. Good morning, Brilliant. The question that I'd like to share with everyone is about, ask you that after lessons of coronavirus crises, authorities of Harare and other cities in Zimbabwe beginning to think about the possibility of total reform of public transport, with addition of new options such as underground train, e-buses, trams, and other new forms of urban transport to improve a functional quality of urban public transport in cities and towns of Zimbabwe.
Good morning. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Local authorities have been looking for options really to deal with public transportation, but it comes with huge amounts of investment to be able to implement such projects. So the issue that we have now in Zimbabwe is that while the government has tried to introduce a small train that runs within the city, and the idea of having cable cars coming, it has all been influenced by the political as well as the economic situation in Zimbabwe, whereby you find politicians overriding certain decisions from the technocrats and other people. So ultimately, you see that while the options are they are there, and of course we have not exhausted them all, but while they are there, it's almost impossible to implement them in Zimbabwe at the moment.
I was wondering too, and I actually would like to open up this question to Babak as well too, as that both your papers really made me think about, remind us that all workers, do not have the privilege that many of us do to stay at home and work from home. And I wonder, Brilliant, you mentioned, what does these infrastructural systems, what would a post-COVID transportation system look like for the residents of Harare? One that would provide safe and affordable public transport for workers. And I'm thinking in terms of, even the design of bus stops. And, I think your papers really got at the idea of the larger urban planning changes that have to be made. And the question could also be extended to construction sites. If we think of bus stops and construction sites as these sites within the city, how does one design a safe construction site? This is something I think often as architects, I know we feel like our responsibility ends somehow at passing off the project to the builders. So I wonder if you both had any thoughts about that.
Oh, who is responding first?
I can go first. Thanks for the question and for having us today. Talking about construction job sites and the layout of the construction job sites, obviously it's totally different. When it comes to larger construction sites like power plants, refineries, and also heavy civil. Me and my colleagues at CPWR, we have been to the job sites over the past several years that there are maybe 4,000, 5,000 workers on the same job site. And it is like a little town. And then we see bus stops, we see the train track, and exactly like a small town. So, and to regulate these job sites, we have a long way, really long way. And as I mentioned in my presentation, carpooling is a huge issue in construction, especially for large mega projects when we need to mobilize workforce from other states to the project job site. And then workers, sometimes they reside together, they carpool together because they're far from their home states. So that is a huge challenge these days. And some financial incentives definitely required. And then we need some support from contractors, from project owners. And also, as I mentioned in my presentation, some contractors came up with this idea of staggering the time, the launch time, the break time, because throughout the shift in construction, we see multiple break times, so we cannot have all the workers take the break at the same time. So these are some practices that contractors are trying to employ to minimize this spread, but it is not an absolute answer.
Okay, so it's now my turn, right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Brilliant.
Okay. Yes, I think in the context of planning and deciding of bus terminus in Zimbabwe, or generally anyone can apply it anyway. I think in my case, or in my understanding, the issue is not much about how these have been designed, particularly with regards to space and allocation, but it's more of that artificial congestion that happens because the city now operates between 9 o'clock because of the lockdown, operates between 9 o'clock and 8 o'clock. So everyone has to be everywhere at the moment. So you find that the reasons why there are these long queues and people are congesting at the small bus stops is because the government is not provided, or they've removed the private owned transportation systems and provided people with public owned buses, with public sector buses, but they are very few. So you find that for a trip to maybe one location from, say, a location in Harare from the CBD, you find that for people to go there, they need maybe with 5 buses, they would take 2 trips, but because the government has provided one, they have to wait for like 10 trips to come. So you find people are crowded at the same place at the same time. So you find in terms of the actual design, you can't really say this is not properly designed. Yes. So I think it's more about converting the city into more of a 24-hour city than that artificial congestion, or you have timed movements where you say you have to be there by this period of time and leave there by this time. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned that. That's a really interesting point about schedule as well too. Just the sort of life of the city, the time in which workers need to be places that, drives that. I'm disappointed, as architects, we always think that we can correct everything through design, but of the architecture. But I understand what you're saying, which is a really good point. Thank you very much to Brilliant and Babak. I'd also like to convey another question from our audience to Robinson about, and then extend it perhaps to include Elizabeth. The question, Robinson, is how do you think this very interesting homework concept could translate in different cultural contexts where concepts of privacy and personal space vary considerably? And this is such an excellent question because Elizabeth, you showed 95 Peckham Road as one of your examples. And it made me think of, yes, what does a post-COVID live-work project look like? And it's very interesting in light of that question to think about similarities and differences between the Ark Plus Space project and also of 95 Peckham Road. Perhaps Robinson, you might start.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think the work housing concept of Ark Plus can be transferred to several societies with different requirements, whether the working space is a shop or an office or whatever. And I could also imagine to combine multiple households that share a working space during the day, and at night the place is separated into 2 or more independent units. But I guess I focused on comparable situations in Germany or in Western countries and something like that that can be compared to the situation in Berlin I described. So I didn't focus in detail in other cultures like in African or Asian countries that have, of course, different problems than in Europe or in the US.
Yeah, and what I found was interesting about the Ark Plus Space project. So Ark Plus is am I correct? It's a magazine or a journal.
That's right. It's an architecture magazine, but the CEO of Ark Plus, it's Anlin Go. He's also an architect, and he also worked with the architect Anna Löbecke on the design of this space.
And so that was for their offices, was it not?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's an amazing kind of, that you would go to work for the magazine and then have a whole living work situation, which is kind of remarkable. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so 95 Peckham Road is in London, where there's a shortage of space anyway, and it's by Peter Barber Architects. It was designed in 2020 and was applauded because it is multiple flats. They describe it as a tenement style housing. I can't remember how many units are in it, but the idea is that everybody in the tenement building has a space to use as leisure, but that space is an outside space. So they might have a balcony, or there's some communal courtyards. They might have a private garden space on the ground floor, and then their work area is their living space. But I mean, space is at a premium in London where that is. So I guess they're making the best they can of the site. It came last year, but it was built last year, but it actually was designed pre-COVID. So the things that I alluded to in my paper in terms of I disagree with Robinson because he talked about open plan living, and in the UK, actually open plan living is, going, because people are finding when they have to self-isolate within their family unit, they need to have space to do that. And so open plan living is, they just can't do it. People are being shut up in their bedrooms and it's quite difficult. So we're thinking that with new design here, that the new houses will be a series of spaces rather than a big open plan space and then, utility areas.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, because I was reading different approaches as well too, as to what there's been this idea of the open plan as, something we've inherited from modernism, and now does that really work, in our current situation? Another really excellent question, Elizabeth, this is probably a good one for you. The practice of architecture has been much dependent on social networks to get work. How will those that are not part of these networks create their own or become part of the existing?
So I think actually, to be fair, in the UK, architectural practices, if you're a small practice, you're a bit behind on the social revolution, and you're not necessarily in social media anyway. A lot of work comes through word of mouth, and there is quite a lot of online networking and business clubs available that you can join, you can be part of, you can pay a subscription to. In fact, most of those online network clubs are crying out for architect members to be part of them. And I belong to one, and we have a meeting at 06:45 a.m. so that the business of the network is over before the day begins. And that's really good. And I work with part-time in a practice, and I get a lot of work through that. Another easy way to get work is to talk to your clients and to get them to refer repeat business to you, or to get them to, they know what your work is like and they can tell their colleagues and their clients. So you can, even if they themselves have a one-off extension or a house, they might know someone who wants work. And then finally, I would say contribute back into the profession. So we have a thing that's just started up called the Architecture Social, in which I'm a participant member. And because I'm active in that arena, it's not social networking, it's just like another platform. I'm active in that arena, and I'm getting quite a lot of queries and people saying, can you help with this? Can you do this? And I think it as much as you can put in is good.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. As you're arguing that, if we see this as an opportunity to dismantle, some of these structures that existed. So when you were talking about the ward system, like this idea of, you're absolutely right. Are there different ways that, and I think the question is brilliant, that, architects urban planners can get work rather than, relying on these sort of traditional recognition systems, kind of like, the Academy Awards and Hollywood film has now been dismantled by new forms of social media. So as you're pointing out, it's the exact same issue in terms of architecture as this sort of, celebrity profession. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that we were very tight on time for the presentation, and I actually had a line in there, and then I took it out, which was that Frank Gehry is too busy looking after himself to avoid catching COVID than sitting at the drawing board and designing new projects. And he's classified as a star architect. So I really think that the star architecture, those white male men are on the decline now, almost.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think that we can argue, that a huge shift like this, a huge change, we can turn it into something positive and turn it into an opportunity to actually, as you argued, really re-examine the future of practice, not just in terms of the methods, but in terms of what our aims are. And it looks like we have just 1 minute left. So I rather than starting another question, I would like to thank the panelists very much for their papers and their energy and provocative thoughts. and to thank the organizers, Caitlin and Mohammed, and to the audience for watching us today. So thank you, everyone.
The next session in today's symposium is Healthcare Design. Papers in this session will explore the current and future design, implementation, and experience of architectural interventions to respond to COVID-19 and its impacts, with a specific focus on healthcare settings. These papers will not only consider the unique implications of COVID-19 within and for practices and settings of health, healthcare, and health promotion, but also will foreground the experience and impact of these design interventions on first-line responders and medical providers in healthcare settings, inpatients and their loved ones, and passers-by and community members. Together, these presentations suggest a range of strategies to prevent and mitigate the effects of infectious disease in healthcare settings in the future, and urge us to do so in a way that considers the needs and experiences of a range of users. The case studies presented in this panel explore innovations in different countries, including Belgium, Serbia, Israel, Sierra Leone, and the USA. The moderator for this session is Dr. Angeli Joseph. Dr. Joseph is Professor of Architecture and Director of the Center for Health Facilities Design and Testing at Clemson University. Dr. Joseph's research focuses on multidisciplinary systems approaches to improving patient safety and quality in high-stress healthcare settings through the development of tools and built environment solutions. She was recognized as Researcher of the Year in 2018 by the Healthcare Design magazine.
Thank you so much, Mohammed and Caitlin, for inviting me to be a moderator for this session. As you introduced me, my work is all in healthcare, and I'm really passionate about the work we do here, along with the clinicians who are at the front lines fighting this pandemic. There has been a lot happening in this field. And while we've been dealing with some of these issues of infection prevention for years, it has taken on a whole other challenge with COVID-19. And I'm excited to hear about all the presentations from these 5 different countries today. So without much ado, I'm going to start with introducing our speakers from KU Leuven, Margot Annemans, Plunji Jelema, and Anne Helgen are with the Research and Design Group at KU Leuven in Belgium. This is a multidisciplinary research team that works at the interface of design research and social sciences and humanities. Anne is a professor of design studies at the Department of Architecture, while Margot and Plunji are both researchers working in this research cross-design group. And on to you then.
It's a great pleasure for me to take part in this symposium and with all of you explore what we can learn from the spatial strategies applied in hospitals to separate COVID from non-COVID patients for the future of architecture and urbanism. Besides in terms of medical care, Corona has brought also considerable challenges in terms of space. In hospitals, these ad hoc spatial interventions range from a complete rearrangement of the admission to the emergency department to expansions of intensive care units with temporary capacity. But also in public space, in supermarkets, etc., the pandemic has had an impact on space and more specifically on the spatial organizations of social interactions. The research presented today was conducted in 6 general hospitals in Flanders that were diverse in location. We had both urban and suburban hospitals, diverse in scale. Some hospitals were one central campus, others were dispersed multi-campus hospitals, and diverse in age. Some buildings were brand new, whereas other ones were over 20 years old and planning renovations. For each hospital, we interviewed someone involved in the infrastructural adaptations, and this could be either a director of care supporting services, technical or facility directors, or a director of quality and strategy. In the interviews, the focus lay on what was being done and how the information process was organized. And today I will focus on what was done. Based on the collected data, we identified 5 strategies applied to separate COVID from non-COVID patients. And these strategies are adaptation of the program, temporary and new infrastructure, putting in new walls, including doors, making use of signage like arrows, fences, and stickers, and implementing new regulations and instructions. Today, I will focus on only 3 of them, on the adaptations of the program, on the temporary new infrastructure, and on the signage. Hospitals adapted the program of their buildings at various levels. At the building level, hospitals made program switches between buildings. For example, they would only admit COVID patients on one campus and not on the other ones of a hospital group. Or they would make program switches between parts, like making use of unused zones or zones under construction, or making use of the pre-narcosis and recovery to change them into ICU wards. On the level of the wards, wards that were meant for COVID patients were closed off from the rest of the hospital with clear distinction between clean and dirty zones. And this required extra functions on the wards, such as additional storage, dressing rooms, and things like that. Sometimes even new functions emerged due to the COVID crisis. For example, a relax space specifically for COVID staff. Here we could ask ourselves the question, what will happen after the crisis? All hospitals involved made use of temporary infrastructure, such as tents and containers, and they were mainly used to accommodate COVID patients arriving at emergency department, where these people are examined, and this is being decided whether they should be admitted or not, and this is often done in collaboration with general practitioners. This additional infrastructure then allowed to increase capacity and at the same time also put stress, on the hospital environment. It took up parking space, it could block entrances, and it could hamper circulation. In order to keep distance, arrows, fences, and stickers were used to direct flows of people, mainly in communal areas, both inside and outside the hospital. In reality, mostly a combination of strategies is being used, as you can see in this picture. The garage for the ambulances is converted to a COVID triage zone with separations being made using temporary tents. In order for people to use this new equipment as intended, extra signage is being put in place. And despite the efforts to maintain a strict division between COVID and non-COVID zones, the borders between both were crossed by people, material, and air. Staff enter and leave the hospital on a daily basis. Waste from COVID wards need to be processed elsewhere, and airflows are not necessarily stopped by spatial divisions. Spatially, the separation is mostly being challenged in the in-between zones, like interspaces and lift and air shafts. Especially in the in-between zones, combining strategies is key to guaranteeing a safe environment. At the same time, interventions in these zones bring existing rules such as fire regulations to heat, with, for example, fire evacuation routes that are being blocked by newly built walls, which may then cause a delay in evacuation when a fire happens. The COVID-related adaptations to the built environment affected almost everyone using the hospital and can be expected to have changed awareness of the surroundings. And this is not only the case in the hospital, but can also be expanded to other types of buildings like the supermarket I mentioned earlier, to schools, or even squares and sidewalks. We saw that in many of these contexts, hygiene and infection risks are brought to the forefront as building qualities. We also identified that there was a rising need for additional spaces to guard people's mental well-being, like, for example, the relaxation zone for staff in the hospital. And we identified an increased spatial literacy amongst a wide group of people who became more aware of the physical environment and how that affects how they relate to others, think of measures in order to keep social distance. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the team from KU Leuven. I see so many similarities between what you're describing here and what we've experienced in the United States. And I love for our speakers from the 91 different countries to talk about which of these issues and strategies have translated to your countries. So feel free to add more to the chat so we can continue the conversation at the end. wanted to introduce the next speaker. She's Shavrula Kautrempe from England, and she's going to be talking about hospital ward flexibility, equity, and virus exposure risk in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Shavrula is an architect and epidemiologist currently completing a PhD in architecture at the University of Cambridge. Her work centers on cross-disciplinary applications of architectural history, building physics, behavioral sciences, and environmental health, aiming to deliver human-centric and performance-driven healthcare design.
In my presentation, I will explore how flexibility can strengthen the equity of exposure to SARS coronavirus 2 in naturally ventilated wards with limited resources. This presentation builds on the findings from my fieldwork at Connaught Hospital, which was a critical case study. The hospital is located on the west coastal zone of Africa in Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown. It is surrounded by a historical network of streets, mixed-use buildings, and informal settlements. Its historical buildings were built according to the basic principles of pavilion plan typology, while today it remains the main government-run tertiary hospital. Drawing on a mixed methods approach, the complex links between thermal conditions, thermal comfort, and adaptive behaviors with seasonal, temporal, spatial, and personal factors were defined, building on a multidisciplinary dataset collected in real time in occupied wards. When natural ventilation is the primary environmental mechanism for cooling and airborne infection control, hospital ward flexibility needs to be investigated from an interdisciplinary perspective that integrates the assessment of the architectural, environmental, and behavioral drivers of ventilation performance with expected clinical practices. In this way, differentiation in exposure and adaptive capacity among occupants can be identified and mitigated. Overall, all four case study multi-patient ward typologies had a beneficial design for the exploitation of natural ventilation. Ward 1 was a tropical nightingale ward, with a bed terrace allocation at the center and the auxiliary uses at the southeast and northwest wings. In the late 19th century, colonial architects and engineers, building on Florence Nightingale's experience in hospital design, developed and applied principles of environmental engineering for the maximization of potential for natural ventilation in colonial hospitals across the equatorial zone. Regarding the drivers of environmental performance in the case study wards, the windows lacked adequate shading devices and double-glazed windows, while internal curtains trapped solar radiation. At the same time, heat gains by conduction through the heavyweight external and internal walls, and by convection through the uninsulated ceilings and floors, reduced the potential of nocturnal cooling, contributed to higher nighttime overheating. Occupancy frequencies and diversity of activities remained high over the morning and evening shifts, creating continuous turbulences that contributed to uncertain distributions and dilutions of airborne pathogens, spreading high infection hotspots further away from patient beds. Although the Nightingale ward had the fastest cooling rate and the most extended periods of lower indoor nighttime temperatures, overall thermal conditions remained above acceptable thresholds. Measured air velocities indicated moderate indoor air flows, with slightly higher air velocities being performed close to a window area with open windows only in the Nightingale ward and Ward 4. Older nurses were more likely to be standing or sitting close to a window area with open windows. Observed occupant control window operation was unresponsive to indoor and outdoor environmental changes, and the group of nurses reported the highest percentages of window opening behaviors, whereas patients experienced the lowest air velocities and had the least control over their exposures. With the intention to minimize both exposure and infectiousness of the viral doses, the recommended interventions aimed at the maximum dilution and minimal dispersion of the pathogenic droplets and aerosols, as well as the reduction in the duration of the exposure of both patients and staff to highly infectious spaces. Modifications to the functional layout, the spatial partitioning, the flows of people, and infection control comprised the proposed design interventions. The recommended functional zones were limited to patient cubicles, a nurse station, the restrooms, and different storage spaces. Airborne transmission of the virus is considered likely, although it does not constitute the dominant transmission pathway. Higher ventilation rates will result in faster dilution and removal of viral droplets and aerosols. However, during periods when fresh air exchanges are low, all those droplets which are heavier than aerosols will land to different surfaces and will be removed through cleaning and disinfection, smaller particles will flow around over more extended periods. These tiny particles are particularly sensitive to pressure differences and turbulences caused by occupants' movement and activities and can travel distances more than 2 meters. Therefore, freestanding floor-to-ceiling plastic partitions were proposed to form single occupancy patient cubicles in the open plan bedded areas. Continuous occupancy over shorter periods was allowed only to nurses, doctors, and cleaners with pre-assigned circulation zones. Additional infection control measures included the following recommendations. Every patient cubicle had its own window within less than 2 meters from the bed. Its bedhead was placed opposite the window area. In this way, medical staff could perform their task with their backs turned opposite to the windward direction. Nurse stations were also close to the window areas. Opening and closing the cubicle doors could contribute to the dispersion and mixing of air pollutants along the corridors. Therefore, in these areas, the installation of upper room UVGI lamps could contribute to stagnant air filtration. Patients had to be stratified between more and less moderate cases with stronger or weaker immune systems and placed accordingly to cubicles with stronger or weaker airflows and securely sealed doors. Furthermore, different hand hygiene stations for different use between patients and staff were installed at critical locations. As the COVID-19 pandemic evolves, historical hospitals, which comprise a significant part of the most fragile healthcare infrastructures across the global south, accommodate the treatment of COVID-19 patients in naturally ventilated wards. Historical wards built according to climate design principles before air conditioning, such as the Nightingale typology, might be more suitable for the treatment of COVID-19 cases, even if their embodied capacity for high ventilation performance might have been partly impaired. The existence of openable windows in hospital wards does not imply an efficient ventilation performance. Occupants need to be trained to operate the windows in climate-responsive ways. In naturally ventilated spaces, although high indoor airflows can be achieved sporadically, the strength and the direction of airflows can be unstable and highly unpredictable. Therefore, the ward's adaptive capacity is a function of the flexibility of its layout, not only to accommodate different clinical practices, but also to maximize the protective impact of fresh air against airborne infection among all occupant types. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravula. That's such an important topic, and not just in healthcare, but almost every building type, we are now thinking about airflow and management of airflow. So that's very, very timely indeed. Our next speaker is Lucy Morheim. She's going to be talking about rethinking personal space needs in hospital settings in the post-COVID-19 era. She's an adjunct lecturer at Tel Aviv University in Israel, and also the director and founder of the course Space Planning, User-Centered Consultancy. She earned her PhD in architecture from the University of California, Berkeley, USA. Her publications focus on user-centered research in architecture and urbanism, post-occupancy evaluations, social and environmental sustainability, and spatial justice topics.
Hi. Analyzing how a building can be best adapted to its multiple users' needs based on evidence-based research is critical in complex buildings like hospitals. This analysis is conducted in an internal medicine ward of Beilinson Hospital in Israel as part of my postdoctoral research at the Technion, and it particularly demonstrates how the match between a ward layout and users' personal space needs influences the experience of the ward corridor for all users, and why psychological factors matter in order to efficiently operate a hospital. Internal medicine wards present a unique problem. Users with competing needs occupy the wards, such as medical team, patients, and visitors. Patients are there at their most vulnerable state without full control over their space, territoriality, and privacy needs. For instance, they don't have control over the layout, who enters and exits the rooms, and when. Personal space needs such as proxemics, territoriality, and privacy are fundamental concepts in environment and behavior studies, as they define our relationship with other people and how we non-verbally communicate with others through use and modification of physical space. The findings of this research show personal space needs play a direct role in density, sense of crowding, and movement of people in internal medicine wards, and in efficient operation of hospitals. These concepts also directly inform post-COVID planning, given the role that distance between people play on how rapidly the disease is spread. Therefore, understanding personal space needs, especially in a building type like healthcare settings where people may be more vulnerable to diseases and where medical teams' health is also at great stake, is extremely relevant and important. In order to understand what might be about the architectural design that causes corridors to feel overcrowded, I created behavioral maps. This was an important question because, as the medical team stated and as the literature illustrates, visitors are needed as caretakers, but visitors also frequently interrupt medical staff, invade privacy of patients' information, and these interruptions may lead to medical errors. Once I created the maps, I tallied the findings and analyzed them, and this is how the behind-the-scenes work looked like. Here you see the floor plan of an internal medicine ward. Each dot represents people that waited more than 3 minutes in the same location. So blue dots are representing the visitors and green dots are representing the doctors. During morning patient checks, every time doctors enter to a room with multiple patients, because of patients' privacy, they need to ask all visitors to go out. What happens then is explained by psychological needs of territoriality and proxemics. Visitors don't want to go far away from their patients. More than half of the visitors were territorial about their waiting area. Also note that there's no nearby waiting areas for them to have visual and auditory access to their patients. So they get out of the room and they try to stay as close as to the room possible. For instance, those that leave this room prefer to wait in this area in the corridor. There's also commotion because if visitors' first territorial choice doesn't work, they go to the next corner, like here, this corner, and when the first choice becomes available, they go back there. So there's constant movement in the corridor, which adds to the feeling of overcrowdedness. Another analysis showed how users' experience and interaction with a certain layout depends on their privacy needs. In hospitals, people are crying, grieving, and talking on the phone. These are all activities that require different levels of privacy. Of all of the privacy-requiring activities, about 77% of them took place in semi-private areas, such as secondary halls, staircase halls, nooks, at far ends of the corridors away from nurse stations and main traffic, and even in vacant rooms like here. Which is to say, people need spaces where they could feel private, but such places didn't exist in this floor plan, so they had to use whatever was available. So these findings illustrate how a simple analysis can reveal something very basic about psychological and environmental needs that architecture should address, but many times such fundamental things can be overlooked if no proper analysis is conducted. To conclude, in terms of design, this analysis leads to reconsidering the design of waiting spaces. For instance, and I'll switch to a previous slide for a second, specific to the Beilinson Hospital, versatile use of this existing meeting room located at the end of the corridor, which is vacated by the medical staff exactly before the morning patient check starts, could be made available to visitors. Its location provides direct visual access to the corridor and to some extent meets the proxemic needs unique to the healthcare settings. Other design solutions for similar behavioral settings may range from creating multiple separate family rooms, for instance, ones that can accommodate large religious grieving families that may require higher levels of privacy, to decentralized small waiting areas for smaller groups, and perhaps creating multiple waiting niches in the corridors that provide quick visual and auditory access to patients. This research also demands revisiting the everlasting discussion about whether shared rooms or private rooms should be prioritized, and points to another consideration in this discussion, given that the number of patients in a room means how many visitors will occupy the corridors during patient checks and increase the sense of overcrowding. And finally, the broader implication of such research and in relation to the post-pandemic planning is to note that personal space concepts are still not fully examined in different contexts. In each building type and sociocultural context, these concepts manifest differently, evident in how this study provided a nuanced understanding of proxemics unique to the healthcare settings and visitor needs in a Middle Eastern culture, and also unique to the operation of this specific hospital and its layout. As sociocultural and spatial contexts change, which also applies to how COVID pandemic is reshaping the ways in which we engage with the space and people around us, these concepts will need to be revisited in order to better understand how design can most effectively meet user needs. So pandemic reminds how these fundamental concepts are extremely relevant today and deserve attention for creating more user-friendly architecture and for managing social distance through architectural design in an informed way. In case anyone is interested in more details, this research is published in Facilities Journal and is available online. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was such a fascinating study. And I think looking at behavior mapping methods is really helpful to understand how people actually live and work in spaces. Just interested to see how other countries are dealing with family visitation during COVID, because I know in the US, family members are often not allowed into units, into ICU units or med-surg units, just to reduce the crowding and to prevent any kind of transfer of infection in the units. So curious to know what other countries are doing in this particular arena. So our next speaker is Katarina Angelkovic from Serbia, and she's going to talk about epidemic metabolism in oncology hospital design practices during the post-COVID age. Katarina is a theorist, practicing architect, researcher, and a painter. She served as a visiting professor and chair of creative architecture at the University of Oklahoma, USA, and she's also taught at in Oslo at the University of Belgrade. She's a full author of the Preliminary Architectural Design, a national project supported by the government of Serbia, related to new building in National Cancer Research Center in Belgrade.
Hello, my name is Katarina Angelkovic, and today I will talk about epidemic metabolism in oncology hospital design practices during the post-COVID age. From the very outset in the 1940s, the oncology hospital in Belgrade was intended to be a teaching and research institute which deals with the basic cancer research, clinical research, but also with preventive and all diagnostic and therapeutic disciplines. Already in the 1940s, the institute had a laboratory for experiments, a histopathological laboratory, and the department for surgery. To date, the complexity of the function has been accompanied by the need to provide adequate planning for the treatment and care and to upgrade hospital capacities due to the increase in the number of cancer patients after the NATO bombing of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999. As part of the initiative of the Ministry of Health Republic of Serbia in 2016, I took part of the team of experts who were assigned to develop a program for designing a new building in Oncology 2. This project is centered on the site of the old building, Institute for Oncology and Radiology, and is the next phase in the redevelopment of the complex of hospital buildings in the heart of Belgrade. The COVID-19 outbreak affected conditions, policies, protocols, and normatives for planning complex buildings, redirecting all multidimensionality of architecture into a time-space monochannel. The context of this research is the dynamic changes in operational and functional environment of the oncology hospital in the post-COVID age in regard to the measures taken to protect a highly risk group of oncological patients. The metabolism metaphor originates in a radical reimagining of the city form in the early 60s, in the Japanese metabolist idea of the city as an organism characterized by transformability, indeterminacy, instability, and unequal growth in its various parts. In this presentation, metabolism is used as a method for analyzing ways in which metabolic regulation maintains a constant set of conditions within the system and control the disease. Instead of maintaining the vital capacity of health, medical, and social systems, the epidemic metabolism has become a mechanism for progressively destabilizing them. Can we say that reimagining the architecture of hospital space and time as metabolically medicalized has now become imperative for such changing conditions, asking what is the role of architecture in these processes? I argue that current concerns with medical processes cannot be articulated in architecture simply by adopting new approaches to physical and organizational structures and technology analysis, but rather to the relationships of production of epidemic metabolism evidence. If metabolism is originally a biological concept used to describe processes and transformations involved in maintaining the vital state, metabolism then symbolizes the state of the epidemic curve, where the curve itself and any bounded mechanism can be measured by metabolic activity. Therefore, epidemic metabolism as a metaphor for hospital design can be used to measure the medicalized flows and to regulate sensitivity of its causal mechanisms in relation to the higher risk group of patients such as oncological. Taking the oncology hospital design practice in Belgrade as my case study, the production of epidemic metabolism evidence is measured in relation to the design of spaces that work to integrate different groups of users in the hospital in order to provide space-time mobilities of people, goods, instruments, and equipment. Epidemic metabolism in its unique sample should allow us to read the current condition in the parts of the building so that the condition is controlled in all enclosed spaces. In relation to the specifics of the oncological diseases, the following issues need to be addressed. Firstly, a special treatment process whose effectiveness depends on the planning of the therapy itself. Secondly, the therapies cannot be delayed. Third, the spread of coronavirus and increased number of medical examinations and operations in reduced space-time frames. Fourth, checkpoints are introduced, as you can see on the picture, to prevent sick patients from entering the building, measuring the body temperature at the entrance and conducting rapid diagnostic tests for COVID-19, as well as opening new entrances and exits. Fifth, hiring guides in the hospital building due to the ban on larger indoor gatherings. Sixth, urgent delivery of medical equipment and materials for protection with regulation of access roads. Seventh, efforts to create conditions in a hospital that would prevent infection of patients and consequently surgeons and other doctors. For example, regulation of the time regimes of movement of all kinds, distribution of goods, food, equipment by other means outside the building, and distribution within the building. To be able to control the pandemic through diverse regimes of circulation, inhabitation, and segregation, it is urgent to prepare realistic scenarios for the harmonization of future oncology hospital design principles in the framework of continuity and change. Firstly, new technological systems and communication structures must be provided. Separation of dirty and clean pathways, as well as the movement of people and goods. It is necessary to add new communications on the facade, delivery of goods, patients, and movements of medical and technical staff, as well as services for regular maintenance of medical linear accelerators and their daily control. Secondly, entrances are separated, measures are taken to avoid undesirable gatherings, and alternative spatio-temporal regimes are introduced. It is necessary to add external elevators within the planned double-skin facade, and also it is necessary to separate the clean and dirty pathways in all units and parts of the building. Third, the regulation of this flow involves reappropriating the facade to the use of light, video, and sound signals in the double skin in an alternating regime, where the mode white means modernist cleaning and returns the system to its initial state of free access for a minimal group of patients, while the intensity of signals increases with the feeling of building capacities. It is also planned to develop a new application on mobile devices. Then, planning air distribution in certain zones, it is necessary to reconstruct the ventilation ducts and throw them out on the skin facade, and providing a generator for automatic power supply for all systems in a case of high-risk situations, in which absence of people must be foreseen. So hospital design, in conclusion, should not be regarded as static assemblage of spaces, but rather a flexible and adaptable network of continuously reconfigurable structures and the supporting mobile infrastructure. In conclusion, Le Corbusier's 100-year-old lesson, which traces the historical curves from the Enlightenment across industrial age, indicates the constant effort of the architects to provide means to prevent disease. The COVID-19 panic is fundamental in the reconnection between body, politics, society, climate change, and other environmental effects. In Le Corbusier's terms, bad metabolism could equate disease with disorder in the city. If transposed to the scale of a single building, this effect could be measured with regards to new architectural orders implied by the transmission of coronavirus. This said, the position of the new oncology hospital should be determined in connection to the traffic corridors, natural environment, and remoteness from the city center. In a long-term perspective, it is necessary to design a whole logistics and medical guidelines, as well as facilities to support separation of infectious from healthy people, and along with special controls and regulations that would come to life in the long run through instructions. Just like tuberculosis and cancer completely reconceptualized the human body and announced the widespread call for organized sports in the early 20th century, as Beatrice Colomina reminds us, in the context of COVID-19, it is fundamental to advocate for discipline and solidarity and to use contagious disease to express concern for social order and political theory. If we put these issues in the basis of political theory, we can imagine the space of a continuously changing environment that we can act upon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katerina. It's very true that in many ways the hospital can be the center or the heart of the places where it locates, not just by providing care to the sick, but also being the location for healthy communities and healthy well-being. So definitely worth discussing further. Last but not the least, I'd like to introduce my colleagues from the United States, Jeremy Cargan and Rolf Hartsted from CRGA Design. They will be presenting visualizing healthcare design's alternative futures through technical and typological innovation. Rolf is a senior vice president with CRGA Design, and Jeremy Cargan is a project architect. CRGA Design is a comprehensive architecture, interior design, and planning firm dedicated to healthcare facility design.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your active interest in this topic. At the recent HCD conference, a national trade event for healthcare design professionals, the buzz was all about imminent changes to the design of healthcare facilities post-pandemic. A panel of experts shared the following observations. Hospitals will require increased modularity to accommodate surges in demand. Facilities will require more flexibility. In other words, individual spaces will have to serve multiple functions. New infection control practices will impact patients' experience of healthcare environments. Telehealth will become more commonplace, and so environments that facilitate telehealth must ensure more effective provider-patient communication. The mission of medical businesses will become more explicitly community-oriented, with a concurrent expansion of the definition of health-related services. Exterior spaces will become increasingly utilized as functional spaces for certain kinds of healthcare practices. All the panelists agreed that the current pandemic is an innovation accelerator, but what will that innovation actually look like? What you'll see following is Jeremy will present two possible futures. One, a speculative medical office building that is very different from most commercial projects of its ilk, at least here in the United States. And secondly, an investigation of what unique problems could architecture solve in our post-COVID future.
The basic premise derives from the sectional diagram. Testing and screening will become a permanent part of all such buildings. Their design will adapt to assure rapid throughput, not unlike airport security. These buildings should and will emphasize outreach, combining well-ventilated public spaces for health education with always needed services like pharmacy and equipment sales. The material palette here emphasizes wood to evoke both efficiency and warmth. Such spaces may have a scale that we have traditionally associated with civic buildings, what the museum was to the 1990s. This new hybrid medical facility may be for the foreseeable future. Now, medical office buildings should and will become destinations with diverse spaces encouraging social and physical activities. Now, a sculpture like this one doesn't guarantee good health outcomes for the kids foolish enough to climb it, but joking aside, roof gardens of this kind should become increasingly popular as neighborhood amenities. This is already true in many countries around the world in different kinds of buildings. Our medical office buildings should join them. Now, we'll still need conventional exam and treatment rooms, but with better vertical access than today. And like any urban building, the topmost floor should be open for public events. Would you book your wedding at the neighborhood MOB Sky Lounge? Well, like I would. Now, before moving on, one word about graphics. We've heard for 50 years about learning from Las Vegas, and it is true that healthcare spaces already make use of environmental graphics to set a mood or to foster serenity. But that's not enough. It's a fight out there, and the fight is a cultural battle for attention, for authority, for belief. This design includes billboard-sized supergraphics in a pragmatic nod to healthcare architecture's need to promote and to advocate and to attract. Advertising works for new iPhones, why not for our individual and our public health as well? Now, the second project came about in response to a colleague's questions. What unique problems must architecture solve in a post-COVID future? In considering a different Baltimore site, an answer might include the following. Architecture must help us manage better our surge capacity during times of crisis. Architecture must help us better manage the spatial interface between sick people and everyone else, between illness and health. And between crises, when the surge recedes, architecture must provide urban amenities not available otherwise. Our cities need transient housing at all income levels. Perhaps a new kind of architecture can address that too. And well, what about fun? Can architecture post-COVID serve up exciting, attractive, urban places? Finally, to consider the message of this conference, what can we learn from architectural history about our post-COVID future? Or for that matter, literary history? As you can see here, Thomas Mann's famous book, The Magic Mountain, is set in a sanatorium setting high in the Swiss Alps. Maybe we need a 21st century urban-focused counterpart. Among healthcare precedents, actually, the 19th century sanatoria provide compelling examples of healthcare architecture with unique adaptations to provide light, air, and quasi-spiritual nourishment for their occupants. Modernist examples, including the brilliant Pamillo Sanatorium by Alvar Aalto, expanded the architectural vocabulary of the type, aligning its aspirational spirituality with austere abstraction. Other buildings from the 20th century asked related questions about exteriority, sometimes purely formal exercises like this crazy example, and sometimes more sophisticated experiments in spatial and programmatic interpenetration like this project by OMA. Examples from the history of art have explored these themes too, whether in illusion or in madness. Our point is this: the contemporary profession of healthcare architecture is usually, first of all, program driven. Well, what could be different if we speculate visually rather than functionally? So that's the background of this project, a future day sanatorium sited right in downtown Baltimore near the Inner Harbor. Whether housing a surge of patients during a pandemic or a flood of tourists during a national convention, this project makes its vertical circulation a public attraction. During times of epidemic, we can use electronic access to control carefully who goes where, defining the interface between the ill and the healthy, while both use the building at the same time. Unlike most urban buildings in North America, this design ignores the usual expectations of building bulk, blasting open views in all directions. And when the crisis is past, the project's small apartments would be available for short-term rental or even longer-term housing for Baltimore's homeless. Best of all, its prime location at the city center would express our willingness to put health and housing at the center of our social contract. That's where it should be. Maybe in a post-COVID future, we can advocate for all these lessons here in the United States, if not elsewhere around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rolf and Jeremy. I think you did a great job in summarizing all the different topics and themes that we're talking about and that we are hearing about, as well as setting us up for a discussion about the future and where we need to go. And I think that's the big issue for all the different panels in your own fields. It overlaps so much with what happens in healthcare, overlaps with what's happening in the home, what's happening in the community. There's so many connections over there. But some of the key themes that I heard across from all these presentations and that have been the topic of concern for me individually as a researcher and a practitioner in healthcare design have been these issues of adaptability and flexibility. How do you respond to a crisis such as the one we're going through while you're in the midst of it? And what do you learn from it for the future? How do you design these facilities so that they can work for the now, but at the same time, in the future, if something comes up, we can flex and expand and adapt quickly to these things in a safe way rather than in the piecemeal way that we've had to at this point in time. So I think those are some of the issues that I'd love for the panelists to think about and be ready to discuss. The one issue that I haven't heard as much about is the concern with end-of-life care and isolation for people who are being taken care of in ICUs and med-surg units where they're separated from their families. They barely have any physical connection either with their caretakers or with their family members. And that is a big concern. Telemedicine is another big factor that's going to impact how we design our buildings in the future. It was always coming, but now with the COVID pandemic, it has become a huge thing, especially in the United States. More and more care than ever before is being provided via telemedicine. And many of the things that may have required a clinic visit could now possibly be done via telemedicine. There are some kinds of emergency care that can also be provided by telemedicine. What are the implications for design? The emergency department continues to be at the receiving end of a lot of the pressure that the system faces. And there are a lot of issues with separating sick patients from visitors and managing flow over there. And many of you talked about the workflow of patients and staff. So I think that's something to think about. Another issue is staff burnout. That is a huge problem. It always has been. And this has pushed it to the forefront, where our staff are working day and night to provide care for highly infectious patients, while at the same time being worried about their own health and the safety of their families. One other thing I'd like to bring out here is the new strategies that are being put in place kind of outside the hospital to provide COVID-19 testing, vaccination. What is the long-term sort of solutions for these facilities? Can they become an addition to our existing hospital campuses, where they can take care of things like vaccination on a regular basis without using the facility resources? And then, of course, the whole issue of airflow. I mean, that is huge. It always has been. But now, especially with ICU care being important and the need for negative pressure rooms, that becomes something to think about that we have to consider here. I've been doing a lot of work in operating rooms. And one of the big concerns has been that ORs are designed to be positive pressure, that the airflow is from the OR to surrounding spaces to protect the patients. But in the context of COVID, the strategy has been to make them all negative pressure, where the patient is potentially the source of infection, and the desire is to protect the clinicians as well as the surrounding spaces. But that has a lot of infrastructure implications as well. So, just with that, I want to actually move it to the conversation with our speakers who have done such an amazing job. And there's some great questions out there. If you would be willing to please have your screens up and as well as your unmuted, then we can have some of these questions for conversation. I'm just going to take a quick look at some of the questions that are here. So one of the questions is from Ram Maikala. He asks, how can elevators be part of future designs? Especially when you're talking about more vertical designs. If you have COVID-19, elevators are often a place where there's a lot of it's a block, and you're trying to distance people. How can the 6-foot distance accommodate people in elevators? So I think that's probably more for Jeremy and Rolf in terms of your future concept for the hospital, and as well as for anybody else.
There's no good answer without spending resources. And, in as much as our projects are social satire, the target of that satire is the need to bring new resources to the healthcare architectural problem. Specifically with regard to vertical circulation, well, the projects we're showing are showing escalators, exterior spaces, and more generally one-way traffic, so that you come in, you go out the different way. But none of those answers are realistic unless the institution is willing to manage the people in a way that serves the architecture and vice versa.
It's an interesting question. I think about negative pressure and different environments as we move forward. We did a hospital, this was actually, we were lucky, it was years ago, where we had a med-surg unit that we could convert to negative pressure, and it actually alleviated the surge, and this was in a rural community. With elevators, I don't know, it's possible to think about segregating elevators and having high-risk elevators. And you could probably, with the shaft construction, think about essentially different pressurization. Certainly you do it with exit stairs. So, I mean, it might be worth an investigation. Also, it seems like one of the more simpler solutions here is airflow and natural air. And certainly there's a lot of precedent of exterior wall elevators, that have views, and maybe they have some ventilation as well.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask Stavroula if she had any comments about airflow, and many of the case studies that you looked at were natural ventilation examples, and like the Florence Nightingale wards. Unfortunately, US hospitals are not designed for natural ventilation. Do you have any thoughts about what we can do in mechanically ventilated buildings that are primarily like that? how can some of your findings apply to other kinds of hospitals?
Yeah. It's much easier for a hospital ward which is mechanically ventilated to be upgraded to a negative pressure room or to a hospital, to a ward which is more effectively ventilated. Actually, when we're thinking about hospitals, we're thinking about a totally controlled environment in terms of different aspects, including ventilation. Well, that is not true for many poorer parts of the world. So in terms of United States hospitals, I was thinking that in rooms where we are uncertain about the effectiveness of dilution and discharge of the pollutants, it is very important to separate highly infectious patients and highly infectious procedures from the rest of the room, and try to expose these expected spaces which will have very dense and high viral loads to the most well ventilated corners of the room or small spaces in the room. So it's about separation, minimization of dispersion, and minimization of the viral dose and the expected exposure.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to add anything around airflow and contamination from your countries and your experiences? Katrina?
I would like to add something about circulation and communication, because I find it very, very difficult in the present moment in Belgrade hospitals, because due to the pandemic, the wideness of the corridors is now very threatened, and people could not circulate with patients and all the goods and all the multiple people who circulate, because there are guides, there are doctors, surgeons, and patients, and also visitors who shall help these patients who are in a very bad condition. And also these corridors are overburdened because of the emergency of this, how do you say that, emergent operations and things like that, because things are very dynamically changed now, and one cannot control. Operations are being just rescheduled every hour and canceled, and that is a problem. So that is why I had this proposition, just to make all these corridors separated and introducing another layer to a facade, so that we can put out everything, all the garbage, the infectious waste. Even some people could only circulate through the facade because they could just, find the shortcuts throughout the building. And that is something that we can think in a fast manner, So, yeah. And also about these entrances and just coming to a building and exiting, I think it is also something that we can regulate very quickly. And that is something that also Oncology Hospital in Belgrade already did with these many containers outside the building, and just controlling with these guides who are circulating with patients to the place where they have their treatment. And they are taking them in, taking them out all the way around. And also there is another problem, because some patients arrive in good condition and they have COVID after 2 days only in a hospital. And that's how the best surgeons just died a few months ago in Belgrade, the best surgeons in the world that we had. So it is a very complicated situation. I also suggest that we need another building, quickly, another building, just to prevent these things and to separate infectious people from healthy people in a fast manner, so that they can just, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Katrina. And I think that directly connects to some of the work from KU Leuven, where you guys suggested that You might want to separate the flow of people, the sick, but it's really hard to do that because people forget where the signs are, the stickers are, right? Do you guys want to comment on that?
Yes, we can. I was also want to pick up on the ventilation issue, as one of the topics we addressed was that making a spatial separation does not necessarily mean that you also make an air separation. And I think raising this, well, it's almost part of this spatial literacy, but then a tiny part of it, making people aware of what that means, air tightness, or even making air separations. We had an example in our study where at a certain ward, they asked for a spatial separation because they didn't want an infection to be spread from one side to the other, but there was only one ventilation system there. And before that could be explained by the people from the technical services to the people on the ward, that they really needed to move to two separate wards, it took a while, and it was really at the core of what people were discussing about at that point. So so that's one thing. But then the flow, separating the flows and making sure that both people and stuff don't get messed up, that was what they first did when they put in all these separation strategies, making the vestibules between the ward and the hallways, both at the entrance and at the exit of the ward. But whether you're able to do that in a logical flow also highly depends on how your ward, for example, is designed, and how your hospital has been designed, how wards connect to each other. So this was really ad hoc work, and really, well, was invented in the moment itself. Often, I think when you would design the hospital from scratch again, knowing all these things, well, many decisions might be taken differently, but then we probably run into something else in a couple of years when we start thinking about new issues that come up. But
absolutely right. I mean, when these hospitals were built 50, 60 years ago, no one anticipated a pandemic, right? And then that's the big question. How do you design for the now, but think about the future and whether it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how over-designed do you make it? Because there's a cost issue associated with that, right? Jeremy, Laurel, I mean, you guys are practicing architects or in the trenches every day. Any thoughts on this whole issue of future flexibility?
Yeah, well, I'm really drawn to, and actually I would disagree with you a little bit, because the typology of hospitals from the turn of the 19th, 20th century was in direct relationship to a pandemic, which was tuberculosis. And that the prototype that we've seen in some of the presentations here, in my opinion, actually led to some more interesting architecture as well, because of the transparency and the layering of those buildings, as opposed to hermetically sealed glass boxes. As far as the future is concerned, I actually think that there's a lot of validity to this on-stage, off-stage concept on circulation. That's what we do in ORs, right? And we're actually doing it in our ambulatory, our primary care facilities now, with separating patients from the service and the physicians. And so the idea of a wall, of an exterior wall that's wide enough to have light and things come through, but also circulate through you, there's opportunities in the larger scale buildings to actually separate the circulation. So I think that's something that's interesting and should be investigated.
Great, thanks. And I know we just have 2 minutes left, but I did want to ask Lucy, I really enjoyed your presentation, and a question about the presence of family members in wards. And I don't know how it is in Israel, but here they're very strict about that. But what role do corridors play during a pandemic in the context of the facilities that you've seen? And how can you provide that connection between the patient and the family member, but still reduce crowding and maintain sterility in these public spaces?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I cannot speak for what is happening exactly during the pandemic, but what I've observed in this research still gives some ideas. And this is first of all, I want to say it's a very social and cultural issue. So it will be different from one country to another. And regarding to what extent families are allowed in the hospitals, there is also changing from one hospital to another. So it's not same across all of the hospitals in Israel either. The one that I observed allowed visitors 24 hours because they wanted visitors to be caretaker at the same time, to compensate for the lack of staff and to take some of the load, like the burden that you were mentioning before, off their shoulders. But what's happening is they are occupying the corridors, creating extra crowdedness, disturbing the staff sometimes when they don't want, and interfering with patient privacy when they are talking about another person's file. But at the same time, both patients and the visitors need that connection. And sometimes every visitor type is not the same. So for example, you have a religious family that has 8 to 10 members, and they're all grieving and they need a space. Or you have another family that is in a chaotic situation, calling other members, inviting them. I know that we are running out of time, so I'm not going to extend it more, but basically there are different groups of people that we need to address, respond to their needs.
Okay. So that's great. I'm thankful very much to this wonderful panel for putting your presentations together and sharing your expertise. I hope everyone's enjoyed it as I have. And again, thanks to Caitlin and Mohammed for organizing this, and back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is going to be my pleasure to introduce our third and final session of the day. So let me just bring up my slides very quickly. And I'm going to change the view. Okay. Our two themes that have run throughout the symposium are equity and social justice, and with good reason. These issues are urgent to consider as we grapple as individuals, communities, and nations with the simultaneous crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, institutional racism, increasing social and economic inequity, and climate change, just to name a few. COVID-19, as with the epidemics, crises, and natural disasters that have preceded it, has amplified and exploited the social inequities in the societies across the world. Who gets sick, with what severity, why, and with what access to therapeutic resources, or even vaccination, is a function of social structures that too often have little to do with what's right or fair. If we learn anything from COVID-19, and especially from the sessions presented over the last 2 days, let it be this: we face an urgent need to seize this opportunity to create and inhabit more just, equitable, sustainable, and salutogenic cities. These ideas in mind, papers in this session will explore how the pandemic has exposed or exacerbated social and economic inequities, how the pandemic has affected in particular vulnerable or marginalized populations, including communities of color, migrants, refugees, and the elderly, how the epidemic has amplified racism across the world, the impacts of each on urban life and experience. In so doing, these presentations point to future priorities for social justice, equity, and inclusion in a post-COVID world. These presentations also illustrate the significance of having a global vision in addressing the issue of inequity, especially in a post-pandemic world. Moderating the session today is Dr. Irene Huang. Dr. Huang is a practicing architect as well as the Assistant Chair of Architecture at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. Dr. Huang has more than 15 years of experience in architecture and design and has worked in a variety of creative and strategic roles. She's currently working on her book entitled Get Practice, Turn Your Architectural Education into a Career, from Routledge, coming up in 2021.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. And I just want to really, thank everyone for making this such a welcoming space, and really, I guess, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about social justice and equity initiatives and thinking, especially in a conference about epidemic urbanism. And so again, I realize this is the 4th round of this conference and symposium, and I just really appreciate all the work of the panelists that are about to present to you guys in the audience. And I appreciate them, especially because they bring together a real combination and diversity of perspectives, of lenses, of different conclusions and recommendations that I think really get to the spirit of what we are all looking to do in terms of understanding the inequities that are in our society and how those inequities play out in the built environment. So first, I want to, again, thank Melinda, Sandra, Amna, Timothy, Chelan, and George for their presentations. I've watched them already, so I got a sneak peek, and really excited to move forward through that. So I would love to introduce Melinda Silverman and Sandra Felix, who are joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa. And I want to just, highlight a little bit of their accomplishments. So Melinda is an architect and an urban designer. She has a degree in politics and architecture, and she, co-authored several various urban policy papers. And Sandra is a design lecturer, and she is also a practicing architect. So I think the combination of their expertise is really interesting because they are combining both the research realms as well as the practice realms. And they, again, are joining us from Wits University in Johannesburg, and they are presenting Responding to an Unequal Society through Agile and Adaptable Teaching Strategies in South Africa, which I found very interesting. So thank you.
Our presentation is entitled Responding to an Unequal Society Through Agile and Adaptable Teaching Strategies in South Africa. South Africa is notorious for being one of the most unequal societies in the world. The map on the right indicates South Africa having the highest Gini coefficient in the world. The image on the left shows the highly differentiated housing environments that characterize our landscape. The abrupt move to online learning threatened to deepen these divides. It made us realize that the studio was a space of freedom for our students, where students from different backgrounds could encounter each other and could encounter their lecturers.
At the beginning of lockdown, we did a series of surveys which highlighted the three main areas of challenges that our students were experiencing. The first one was a lack of access to the CAD and computer labs that were on campus. The second one, a very high 32% of our students struggled with either data or bad connectivity. And over 25% of our students had a lack of workspace, the very need for that studio that Melinda was talking about earlier. What this meant was that over 25% of our students through most of lockdown were either failing or at risk of failing. Here a student shows us her living conditions. She lives in a very small flat with quite a large extended family in a low-income housing development on the outskirts of Johannesburg city. Here you can see her small bedroom that she shares with a sibling and where she needs to both sleep, entertain her friends, and do any of her university work. This beautiful drawing sent to us by a student was done on brown wrapping paper, simply because she didn't have access to white paper. So a lack of access to basic amenities for architectural students like pens, pencils, and white paper is something that's taken for granted, but not for our students who had to go back to quite rural areas. In South Africa, there is a very high incidence of unreliable electricity, poor connectivity, and unaffordable data. This is a WhatsApp conversation between student and design teacher where they highlight that they can't attend a lecture or a crit because they don't have any power. And when we ask them to message us when the power comes back on, they tell us that they're not sure if they're even going to have data when the power comes back on because their data is fast running out. Inadequate hardware and software was also a huge issue, with students not being able to access the CAD labs on campus. A lot of students didn't even have laptops, and those that had laptops had very low end laptops that were struggling to deal with the architectural softwares that architectural students and architects use. Here you can see a student just showing me how she's really struggling to do anything with her laptop, and it's causing huge frustration. The institutional response to lockdown was a number of initiatives. The first one was to standardize systems of teaching. and to encourage everyone to use what they thought was the most effective online platforms, such as Microsoft Teams and Zoom. But these had very high data costs. They also wanted us to maintain student-teacher hierarchies and workloads as per pre-COVID arrangements. These responses, however, failed to acknowledge both the diversity of our students and the diversity of our student needs. We had a number of very student-led strategies that we started immediately in emergency online teaching. The first one was to proactively fundraise for both data and hardware, getting laptops or monitors to students and getting data packages to students. You can see by the correspondence from students shown on the right-hand side just how grateful these students are to be able to continue their online learning. What this meant, however, was that there was an intensification of communication between students and teachers that carried on into the night, very often outside working hours, mostly because data was much cheaper and is still much cheaper at night. All of this encouraged new forms of dialogue between students and teachers. On the left-hand side, you see a student who would draw on BUMF over her own drawings and then send us pictures with kind of little text messages as to what she was trying to do, and we would phone her back. On the right-hand side was a student who was really struggling with the spatial organization of a building and would send us these video clips taken with a cell phone. What we realized is that you can see here, there's a student who has access to high-end software. So we had to differentiate design excellence and extract it, irrespective of digital or analog methods. Because some of our students, like this student, didn't have access to hardware and software and was mostly reliant on model building and hand drawing to show us what it is that he was thinking and designing. And therefore, we needed to encourage and ascribe value to these analog methods as separate to the digital methods of the previous student. We did have students, however, as you can see by this student, who through model making and hand drawing were able to get to a very high quality of design.
So the learning for us was essential if we are not going to deepen the digital divide. First of all, we learned a number of lessons for the studio. The fact that teachers were able to mobilize funding in the face of COVID, but we are concerned that this might not be replicable in the future. We, I think, also were quite successful at facilitating and encouraging different modes of communication and different channels of communication. We learned to ascribe value to hand drawing and analog design thinking and not to be seduced by sexy digital drawings. And most importantly, we tried to create an enabling and supportive environment so that all of our students felt supported. There were also important conclusions for the university. The initial strategy of using a one-size-fits-all strategy was clearly not going to work. The university needs to acknowledge and support the diverse methods of learning and teaching, but also acknowledge that this involves extra work on the part of lecturers. The university also needs to acknowledge the importance of the studio itself as a physical workspace and the importance of bringing some students back to university to use this important amenity. And then the university needs to rethink its funding. If all students cannot access digital means, some students will inevitably fall behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. And I would like to basically just talk about really quickly, to transition, some of the things that really stuck out in my mind is just how quickly you know, the faculty of have to often think through how quickly education is being delivered. And I really appreciate the idea that those solutions are both fast and slow. So next I want to welcome Amna Shehazad, who will be presenting from, I think, Pakistan. And I want to just highlight some of her accomplishments. She is of our next generation, recent graduate of Beacon House National University, and also has completed some of her studies in Berlin, Germany. And I want to welcome her to present her presentation on pandemics and the exacerbation of social inequities in urban informal settlements in Pakistan. Thank you so much.
Hello to everyone attending this online symposium. I'm delighted to be given this opportunity. Let us begin. Pandemics are also urban planning and design problems and have undoubtedly begun to expose social inequities around the world. History has highlighted numerous critical vulnerabilities in a society at the intersection of public health and urban design. Now that the world has faced an unprecedented change at the face of a global pandemic, the decision of urban planners, bureaucrats, and policymakers about urban informal settlements are being brought into question. As the world has braced itself with COVID-19, we have been instructed to wash our hands, observe social distance, and self-isolate. But what if I were to tell you that based on social inequity, you were unable to do these things? Please allow me to share with you some facts. The census of 2017 indicates an urban share of 75.6 million of a total of 207.8 million population of Pakistan. Furthermore, the United Nations stated in 2015 that the population living in informal settlements account up to 45.5% of total urban population. Therefore, by an estimate, 34 million Pakistanis are currently living in urban informal settlements where even the most basic needs are scarce. Let us now look speculatively upon Karachi, Pakistan's largest city and a host to a population of over 16 million. According to research, nearly 60% of these people live in informal settlements with insubstantial access to clean water or sanitation. The most basic of all given instructions in attempting to contain the spread of COVID-19 pandemic is washing our hands with soap repeatedly through the course of the day. While it sounds like a fairly simple task, it is next to impossible in Pakistan's informal settlements, as more often than not, they are deprived of clean drinking water. The access of water varies significantly based on factors like social inequality, unfair distribution of wealth, and class difference. According to research presented by Dawn reflecting upon Karachi's informal settlement of Machar Colony, it requires purchasing of water through water tankers. For poor households, frequent hand washing as a necessity in COVID-19 circumstances exposes inadequacy of cheap water provision. Furthermore, the exacerbation of social inequities, especially in regard to existing water infrastructure, has indicated an even larger problem. The reports of International Development Research Center conclude that a thorough inspection and repair is needed most urgently in urban planning to ensure infrastructure upgradation, especially when it comes to public health. This now brings me to my second point of discussion, the recommended measure of social distancing and its practicality in the existing spatial construct within these urban informal settlements. Karachi's urban lab analysis showed the impossibility of implementing social distance in informal settlements like Pathan Colony due to alarming levels of population density in an unjust distribution of space within the poorly planned urban setting. A research carried out shows that people are currently living in an average family size of 8 to 9 people in a plot size as small as 20 square yards. This hardly allows the accommodation of a single room, a kitchen, and a toilet. The safety and security of these urban residents, economically and health-wise, is under threat. More so during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially due to the plot size to density ratio. Considering the general lacking availability of space in the city fabric for the already vulnerable urban majority, the curfews and lockdowns have enforced confinement of these urban dwellers in small, dense, and unsanitary spaces. This brings me to my third point of discussion, that involves reflecting upon the health of the vulnerable. Urban informal settlements in Karachi are under constant worry of eviction. According to resources at Dawn, in Karachi's district central, over 1,000 households have been affected and rendered homeless. This has greatly contributed to eviction anxieties amongst urban residents and has caused to create increased levels of psychological stress. The implementation of lockdowns for the residents of these informal settlements has also widened the already present social and economic gap between classes. Factors contributing to inequality and social injustice also contribute to uncertainty, insecurity, and stress, resulting in compromised immunity of the already vulnerable population to become even more vulnerable in COVID-19 circumstances. Please allow me to sum up my case studies and research with a few observations and recommendations. The lacking accountability of a fragmented governance has obstructed inclusive planning processes. Planners, designers, and policymakers can no longer overlook these informal settlements. Moving forward, emphasis should be laid to ameliorate urban infrastructure and provide both urgent and long-term solutions with strong prioritization of social equity amongst the vulnerable population, as highlighted especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. These densely populated areas and their increasingly unsanitary environments has accounted for devastating impacts not only on the health but also on the livelihood. Normalized and overlooked practices of social injustice now more than ever would leave the whole city, if not the whole country, at risk, if not addressed most promptly. Therefore, restoration of local government to promote participatory planning processes in urban development, coordination with community representatives, and a prioritization of emergency budgets to ensure provisions of cheap water in these urban informal settlements would be the way forward in these desperate and demanding times. Thank you for your attention. Hello to everyone.
So I just wanted to highlight some things that stuck out to me about Amna's presentation. And I think one of the main thoughts that I think is significant is the idea that there is a real tension between solutions and strategies that may be applicable in one context and completely, we would say, useless in another. And so I think this is also a real point in terms of thinking about social equity, social justice in our built environment, and how we as both architects, urbanists, thinkers, practitioners, researchers, how we are queuing ourselves up to contribute to that variety of work. And so next I want to welcome Timothy Ojel, who is joining us from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. And I want to again highlight some of Timothy's accomplishments. So he is head of the Department of Architecture at the University of Ibadan. He also holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Lincoln in England. And I hope that we are able to celebrate some of his other accomplishments, but I do want to introduce his paper and his presentation, which is titled Reinterpretation of Traditional Urban Space, Social Justice, and Power Relations in Post-COVID Lagos, Nigeria.
We are looking at Lagos in the post-COVID situation. We're looking at the impact of reinterpretation of the urban space. Lagos is the most populous city in Nigeria and the African continent. Lagos is located close to the Atlantic Ocean, and it is the former capital of Nigeria shortly after our independence, and then the capital was moved to Abuja, as seen in Figure 1. But Lagos is regarded as a commercial capital of Nigeria, and it's a major financial center and economic hub for the whole of Africa. In fact, 1 out of 5 Nigerian, 1 out of 5 Black person is a Nigerian. So that means if you are looking at Nigeria, if you look at Lagos, then you can as well understand what is happening more or less, to a Nigerian or to the African continent as a whole. So the population of Lagos grew from 267,400 in 1952, a small one, to roughly 665,000 people in 1963 at a rate of 8.6% per annum. And United Nations conducted a study in 1995 and discovered that Lagos is the number 29 largest urban center in the whole world with 6.5 million people. And that certainly moved to 23rd position in the millennium, in the year 2000, to 8.8 million people. And they now projected that by 2025, Lagos will have 18.9 million people, which is even bigger than Cairo. So that makes Lagos very important study point for us to consider. And Lagos, as this is entry port to Nigeria, so to say, it has a seaport, it has a lot of road network that linked the whole of West Africa, the ECOWAS bloc, and even by extension to the Sahel part of Africa. So Lagos is an important, as I said, to look at. Next slide, please. So when we talking about traditional urban spaces, we are talking about public squares, we're talking about food markets, we're talking about streets, we're talking about city core neighborhoods. And most of our cities in Africa mirrored our traditional sensibilities. So the tradition is locked in most of our spaces. So, and we need to understand that for us to study and to look at the impact of coronavirus, for instance, in the post-COVID age, we must talk about these spaces and how they influence our lifestyle and vice versa. What we discover in the current situation is that the first world is only talking to itself. In the outbreak of the coronavirus, for some reason, social justice was forgotten. The aspect of "I'm your brother's keeper," axiom is more or less forgotten. The developed nation think more of themselves. The big nations bought all the vaccines, and they usually ignore the developing world. So the world has a responsibility to include the others, so to say, in the post-COVID discord. So we must not ignore Africa, because we discovered that 70% of the population in Lagos are below the age of 40. So the future of the world, or the workforce of the world, is in Africa. So we have to think of them. We have to plan about them. So, and they occupy these traditional urban spaces that we talk about. So at the moment, there's no clear health policy to isolate and treat working class people, the urban poor, and how they mediate or use traditional urban spaces that we are talking about. Next slide, please. So the findings that I got from my recent research to the fact that many of these urban space users are disfranchised by the prevalence of the pandemics. Most of them cannot go to work, they are locked down, they're isolated, and they use these urban spaces, these traditional urban spaces, for their livelihood, but they are cut off from it because of this pandemic. So, as I said, 70% of the Lagos population are below the age of 40 and were deprived of a voice. Because of this, they have to react. The government is not planning for them, refuse to do things for them, and even the money paid for COVID-19 tests is beyond them. The treatment is so exorbitant. For instance, 300,000 naira is charged for these, specialized clinics. So that is beyond the large population. So that suggests justice is not being done. Many are forgotten. The equity aspect is being forgotten. And for us to have a wholesome development, as shown in that figure 3, the polity must respond to these 7 dimensions of sustainable development. You must think about the culture, about the politics. Those things has to be considered. The spiritual aspect, the human development, the ecological, everything must come together. We must not think of one and neglect the other. Society must be taken care of in our discourse to be able to understand how to undo the breakout pandemics in the developing world. Next slide, please. So that points to what we call the power relations among these various segments of society. The working class people, the middle class people, the elites, they have a kind of a relationship. I discovered from my, recent studies that the elite have more access to specialized hospitals in highbrow Lagos, and the people in the deprived zones have no access, at all to these specialized hospitals. So the elite think more of themselves, which is a shame. So the aspect of social justice is absent because of this prevalence of the post-COVID outbreak. So African countries as a whole have no clear-cut path to vaccination, as we see. Even at the moment, the current matter issue going on around African countries. So this is sad. And we are even told that just 20% of Africans are expected to be vaccinated by year 2021. That's even by the WHO, saying that by the end of 2021, only just 20%. So this is aspect of power relations that we're talking about between the first world and the third world, developed world and developing world. And then embedded in it is aspect of social justice, as shown in that diagram, figure 4, the Shakpati diagram of urban network in relationship, where we see the size of the Shakpati, and that's a kind of pie chart that shows the power relationship between various segments, the shoppers, the traders, the market women, the infrastructure aspects, and how they're able to influence one another. Proper understanding of this will help us to handle the post-COVID society very well. Next slide. In conclusion, our core memories are locked in traditional urban spaces in the developing world. Our culture are found there, and they are impacted by the continuous transformation brought about by these pandemics. So there's no way we can run away from it. So to understand how to handle, to contain this epidemic, we must actually understand these traditional urban spaces and know how to handle them very well. So, and that will translate to reality on ground in terms of having provision of quality infrastructures, which is lacking at the moment. Basic health facilities, not only for the elite in the highbrow Lagos that they can only afford, but thinking of how to, distribute and bring down facilities to the common people in the traditional urban spaces, in the food markets, in the streets, in the lockdown, city core neighborhoods. You must see how we can help them through proper transportation, through basic education and enlightenment, so that it can lead to containment and eventual eradication of these disease. So that is taken for granted in the developed world. In Europe as a bloc, or Britain here, we have the safety nets that everybody have access to, health and COVID tests without being asked to pay any money. But over there in Africa, for you to be tested for COVID, you must pay. And the money is not even cheap. It's so exorbitant. And these are the kind of social justices that is impacting on the urban people and the use of their spaces and non-use of their spaces. So we need to understand that planned and built environments must carry the seed of social justice for it to be successful. Thank you.
So thank you, Timothy, for your presentation on really outlining just how difficult difficult strategies for a healthy built environment are and for a healthy society are, but especially for highlighting how complex and how much coordination needs to happen between these highly complex considerations. And I'm really excited to hear in the discussion how we might address some of those gaps. How do we begin to navigate the deficiencies that are in our current systems? And then also, how do we acknowledge the built environment as something that is also as alive as much as the people are alive, and that is subject to change almost as rapidly as our society is changing. So with that, I want to introduce the final presentation for this particular session. And I want to first introduce Chelen Pashalar, who is an associate professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning. She's also the assistant dean for research and extension at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. And her co-presenter is George Hallowell, an assistant professor of practice in the School of Architecture at North Carolina State University, also in Raleigh. And George has a doctorate in design from North Carolina State University. So again, I want to welcome the co-presenters, especially because of the combination of their expertise and how they are able to bring that expertise to play in a common discussion about an examination about shared, accessible, and healthy streets in post-pandemic American cities.
Our current research explores how the COVID-19 pandemic has altered the way that people socialize, travel, and experience their neighborhoods, streets, and public spaces. This presentation will particularly focus on the challenges that many of our cities are facing today. We will highlight the importance of shared, accessible, and healthy streets in high to low density urban areas and further consider what this means for post-pandemic cities. The idea of converting urban streets into shared, accessible, and healthy environments for public use, in other words, recovering street space from the car, is not a new idea. For example, Boston developed complete street guidelines in 2013 with suggestions for physical layouts that reduce car dominancy. Other cities have adopted shared street programs that include living, open, or complete street approaches and human-centered, healthy and green street design strategies. COVID-19 has certainly accelerated this trend in many US cities. During the pandemic, some streets were converted into shared corridors that encourage improved safety and healthy activity. These corridors with limited car access resulted in increased space for distance outdoor dining, biking, recreation, and walking. Streets as outdoor spaces have a new meaning now, but we need to ask the question, how are they changing? And will they become more accessible to all citizens post-pandemic? Keeping all this in mind, we will look at how these concepts and related strategies are being utilized, expanded, and accelerated during the pandemic. The first concept to consider is the rapid deployment of shared streets. On the left side of this slide, we see busy urban streets in Chicago and Brooklyn, showing us conditions before and during the pandemic. Navigating narrow sidewalks while attempting to stay 6 feet away from others can be tricky as we attempt to walk around signs and other sidewalk furniture. Such obstacles can be especially difficult to navigate for people with mobility or vision impairments. The need for social distancing is even more challenging when the streets have only a sidewalk on one side or none at all. Shared street initiatives are intended to give people and businesses more room in the streets, transforming road areas reserved for driving or parking into pedestrian zones. Where sidewalks are too narrow for physical distancing, they're extended into the road. With more pedestrian area, it is easier for users to move safely through the streets while maintaining appropriate distance from one another. Many restaurants and retail businesses are also relying on curbside access and space for outdoor dining. By opening the streets to people and providing flexibility for other users, opportunities are created for safe outdoor dining, retail, exercise, walking, and social engagement.
Accessibility is crucial to the success of any public space, especially in promoting diversity and inclusion. When shared streets are created with equity and accessibility in mind, they allow residents living in under-resourced neighborhoods, older adults, and people with disabilities to have an equal opportunity to use the street space. Shared streets can greatly enhance access to critical community amenities, such as food stores, pharmacies, and medical offices. A Chicago study shows that some residents have no pharmacies or grocery stores within walking distance of their home, and many residents don't own cars and suffer health conditions such as diabetes. Easy access to such resources is also crucial during a pandemic, as COVID vaccine distribution can occur through pharmacies. Limited access to critical services such as healthy food is an ongoing problem for many communities due to a lack of well-designed streets. The middle image of a neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, shows half-mile walkable circles around food stores in red and blue lines of available sidewalks. Many areas are not walkable, lack sidewalks, and have limited access to food or services. In neighborhoods such as these, providing shared streets can increase access to local services and healthy food beyond the pandemic. When walking, biking, and public transit are convenient and flexible, cities can experience higher levels of safety, social cohesion, environmental quality, accessibility, and equity, also helping residents improve their mental and physical well-being. In response to COVID-19, cities like Boston and Seattle have accelerated their work to improve street safety and transit as a part of their Healthy Streets program, which aim to give residents better access to jobs, neighborhood retail centers, and open spaces. As they allow access and continued use of parks, farmers markets, and greenways, cities are converting portions of existing streets and public spaces with the hope of keeping people moving and healthy. the challenge of providing equal access to safe streets, sidewalks, parks, and other public spaces still exists for many cities. For example, in Oakland, 48% of residential parcels in the city were within a 5-minute walk of park or public space before the crisis. But with the rollout of slow or shared streets, a further 24% of homes are now within a 5-minute walk of a slow street, and 12% of residents have access to a public space within walking distance for the first time. A recent Gallup survey found that existing public streets in many neighborhoods lack safe or wide enough sidewalks for social distancing. A majority of respondents use roads and sidewalks for recreation and exercise. Streets are no longer just about moving between destinations. People are using streets and sidewalks as their destination. Spending time on the street was an important factor for their mental health. During the pandemic, people are rediscovering how important public spaces are, how much they rely on them to relax, exercise, and get fresh air and sunshine. The use of shared streets has increased with new activities and forms of urban life emerging. But streets, sidewalks, and other public spaces are not always accessible by everyone. Social distancing and mobility limitations can further exacerbate these inequities. So care must be taken to provide equal and easy access. However, reviews of temporary shared streets are largely positive. In a survey of the Oakland program, 77% of respondents said that they were in support of the slow streets effort, and 95% said they would continue to use slow streets even after COVID. In another survey in Chicago, 66% of the respondents wanted more shared streets to have the program continue into the next year. The fact that streets were closed to traffic almost overnight during the pandemic allowed people to experience shared streets on a temporary basis, perhaps lending support for a more permanent solution. For cities adapting to emerging forms of mobility over the last decade, now might be a good time to get public feedback on ways to use streets without first spending construction money. Cities can also learn what design components of a shared street are most successful and which features provide the most equitable and sustainable solutions.
Thank you, Chelan and George, for your presentation. What comes to my mind is, the power of architecture beyond the production and implementation of buildings, but actually to reconsider again the complexities of how human occupation, human life occurs, and to really think through, a concept like slow streets and how that can actually how the power of reprogramming our physical spaces is as potent as the redesign of a complete infrastructure or the redesign of a city area. So in terms of the moderator response, you'll see me guys looking, you guys will see me looking a little bit at my notes, and I wanted to just give you a little bit of my background to maybe help contextualize a little of my interest in social justice and in equity, and why that is something relevant to my particular expertise, which is in architecture. And so I think I've always been, I was looking back to some of my earlier thoughts on architecture when I first became an architecture student. And I was looking back to my graduate school essay in which I wrote, I hope that I'm able to use architecture to communicate with and contribute to society. And I think that really goes to the core of why I see strength in the built environment as something as powerful and as necessary as government, as law, as economics, as health. I think all of those things are radically intertwined and profoundly intertwined. And so I really appreciate this panel. I really appreciate this topic being included as part of the epidemic urbanism. I wanted to talk through kind of 5 points. And the first one is the idea that one size doesn't fit all. When we're thinking about solutions, or we're thinking about tactics to deal with injustice, to deal with inequity, there is a real reliance on our current, our current society, I would say global, to look toward technical answers, to look toward technical expertise. And I would say that again, that one size fits all is also a kind of myth of the power of a single solution to really create lasting change, and change that is also flexible and dynamic. The second question or maybe thought I'd like to pose to the panel and also to the audience is this idea or this struggle, what I see a tension between ambition and observations, you know, basically what's going on and how can we change it? And then obviously for me, the tension really relies with implementation. So one example that comes to mind that's happening in the United States is that, you know, the great idea is to have a vaccine, a COVID vaccine and several COVID vaccines, but the actual hard work comes in, the real struggle comes in when we're trying to understand how we actually get those shots into people's arms. How do we actually deliver and get to the end of that process? And again, you will see the obstacles created by inequity. You will see the problems created by these kind of structural differences in access to resources. The third one, this leads me to my third point, which is structures of inequity. And if we talk about architectural infrastructure, built infrastructure, the urban infrastructure, I don't think that that can be separate from these structural, cultural, psychosocial infrastructures that we also have that may be invisible in terms of our core expertise in these more technical or formal or built solutions, but are no less important. And I think in that sense, to me, I also appreciate something as simple as this, as all of our participants participating in this conference in English, because English has become the language of science, has become the language of intellectual or scholarly work. And that is also an inequity. That is also something that we are struggling with. I remember a recent anecdote that I heard where where China was actually thinking of no longer using their traditional written language or written script in order to accommodate or be able to plug into the Western technology boom. And so, how do they contend with inputting Chinese characters in a QWERTY keyboard? So again, these inequities are resonant for all aspects of humanity, of human existence. The fourth point I'd like to make is a little bit riffing off of what I was thinking, what I mentioned before was just these divides, these gaps. Some of our presentations really emphasized the gaps that are, again, really prohibiting us from understanding how to combat inequity. And again, these resources, how do we plug into these resources? How do we begin to build or rebuild these structures through a more equitable structure? So those divides come in the form of money, they come in the form of the rural-urban divide, they come in the form of young and older adults, religion, cultural customs and traditions. So all of these things, again, form part of society, but I would also posit are really integral to our built environment. And lastly, I would just like to highlight for your guys' consideration, the battle also that I see between simplification and complexity. So as we have seen throughout these all 2 days of presentations, there are incredibly complex layered ideas that we are grappling with. And those have solutions that are also complex and layered. And I'm wondering from our contributors' perspective, from our audience perspective, how do you guys, how are you dealing with this struggle between a real desire towards simple, immediate answers that make sense, and the actual complexity of the society and the kind of the problems we're dealing with, as well as the potentials and futures that we see for us. So I would love to invite my fellow panelists to turn on their cameras, and I think I would love to actually start off with a question that we have from the Q&A box, and please feel free to drop questions in. I realize that this is an ongoing conversation, but I think our first question is directed for Amna, and it is about, could slum upgrading be a solution to urban informality, and how could standard housing be provided?
Thank you so much for addressing this question, and I was just waiting till the Q&A to answer this question. So like you said, this is like a very sort of diverse sort of settings that we see all around the world. So maybe my answer would not be justified to be placed in every setting, every solution, but I can always, speak about what I think would work in our local context. So generally, we do see practices of regulating building standards coming into play. We see how slums are being uplifted to urban settlements. We see low-cost housing coming into play. We see incremental housing coming into play. We see a lot of vernacular building materials and building methodologies being, used all across to sort of try and cater this very sort of complicated process. And like you said, that all of these issues that we are facing they're complex, they're layered, so we do not have one specific answer to them. We need to accommodate both the tangible and the intangible aspects of the infrastructure to begin to cater to these problems that we're facing. And again, we need to basically emphasize that there are some short-lived solutions that are perhaps being catered to at the moment, but at the same time, we do need to come up with long-term solutions for these sort of problems that we have started to face and started to realize, rationalize, and see that they're exacerbating within this, as soon as COVID hit us. So I think that is one answer of the many possible answers to the question that has been asked.
That is really helpful. And I know we have some other questions in the queue, but I actually wanted to prompt Sandra and Melinda, because I just appreciate how much you were able to also, like Amna, think through these short-lived solutions, these on-the-fly solutions. You were really, hacking through the system of teaching, right? And facing all of these inequities and accesses that I also find very culturally grounded. So for instance, in the US, we have different ways of understanding data. And I was really struck by how you ended up having to shift your schedules to accommodate students that could have bigger or higher bandwidth in the evening. And I hope you guys don't mind me actually prompting you to speak a little bit again, also in relation to Amna's work, is just how quick how quick you had to be, how agile you had to be, and also are some of those solutions more long-standing or more short-lived?
So maybe I can jump in and then Sandra can talk too. I think we jumped in very quickly and we did have to be very agile. I was completely sort of distressed. We had a staff meeting about 3 days ago, and the immediate response from the university after a year of having to be adaptable and agile and responsive to our student needs, once again, the attitude was, how can we standardize? How can we find a solution, one solution that's going to work for everybody? So that the kind of institutional pressures for standardization are immense. And I think that was that's going to be the constant struggle that we're going to have to fight. I also just want to make one point which I think works across all of the presentations, and particularly in the developing world, and particularly maybe in relationship to what Amna just had to say, is I think the strategies that we have to think about are strategies that support the urban commons rather than the individual units. So for me, when Amna talks about slum upgrading, I think less about the individual house than I think about let's say, a communal water collection point, similar to the last presentation on slow roads, and similarly to the role that our studio played. It's a commonage, and it needs to be supported in every possible way. I hand over to Sandra.
Yeah, I agree with Melinda. We had to become extremely experimental, but actually just student-led. It was a unique situation, and we had to really just follow our students where they needed to go, where they could go, the times that they were available, from WhatsApp to telephone calls. that's what we had to do. So I agree with Melinda, and I agree with you, Irene, when you say, one size does not fit all. One of the projects we did last year with our students when COVID hit was like a COVID project. We thought, okay, let's understand what are all the problems that they're facing. And one of the interesting things that came out, Amna, and maybe it relates very much to your presentation, was what we found in some of the urban informal settlements, especially in and around Johannesburg, that there was this incredible public water infrastructure. In other words, just the very fact that 4 households were sharing a water point actually meant that that water point was publicly available to anyone who walked past and needed to wash their hands. It was something that actually, counter to what we were thinking, was not available in the more formal areas of our city, but was readily available in the more informal areas of our city, but urban areas. Obviously, the rural areas, they were dealing with the same issues that Amna was talking about, having to bring water very long distances from kind of rivers, etc. But it did mean that you needed to look at places in a different light. You couldn't make any assumptions. You needed to be, like Melinda said, agile, resilient, and very experimental. Put aside everything that you thought teaching was about and just kind of one day at a time, go where the students needed you to go.
And I think that that's a great segue, right? This idea that you have to just jump in and you have to be so agile and to think quickly. And I'd love to actually, pose a question to Timothy. And it's a little, if you guys don't mind bearing with me, it's a little bit of a mashup between some of the questions we've gotten online from our audience and also some of my own personal interests. But, again, we were talking a little bit, I think, Timothy, your project or your presentation really highlighted this idea of gaps, right? This idea that there are these mismatches between government, there are mismatches between the young and the old, there's mismatches between the first world and the developing world. And so I wonder what you think about how social equality and things like functional justice might be achieved in these kind of complex socioeconomic environments. I mean, I love the chapati diagram because it was just so significant about just how many factors people who are dealing with the built environment are thinking about. And I think, again, we are competing with that simplification idea where people think that those of us working in the built environment are just thinking about a particular building and that particular system. And so what are some of your thoughts, Timothy, in terms of those gaps and the complexity? What are some of the future tactics that might be in play, especially in Lagos?
Yes, I think we have to. Thank you very much for the question. We have to think of the world as a community. The global south and the global north, they have to talk together. This issue that we have the developed world having all the vaccines, for instance, and up till now, nobody is talking about Africa. I know we have government in Africa, but they're inacute. This gap is there, and the reality, we're in the same world, we're in the same planet. We can't take the rocket out of the world and go to the moon and go and live there. We are all on planet Earth. And the air is going from Africa to Europe, back to America. We are connected one way or the other. So there must be a concerted effort from the World Organization, like WHO, like the United Nations, to interfere in our part of the world to ensure that the less privileged are actually taken care of. We have to think of them, the urban poor. They are human beings, for crying out loud. So if the government of that country or the countries we are talking about are not doing anything for the urbans, for the cities, the world government must come to our aid. Because people are there and they are dying. They are not being reported. For one, corruption is everywhere in our part of the world. So it's a reality in architecture and urban development and city development in our part of the world. What do we do? It's a question for all. I don't have the answer because it's very complex. But we can start somewhere. We can appeal to our morality. The developer must, how do I put it now, release some of those things, the hate they have, not in terms of money now, but vaccines, for crying out loud. I heard, even this morning I was hearing in Al Jazeera news that Eurobloc is blocking exporting of the vaccine to other parts. Some nations have 4 times vaccine that they even need. And my Nigeria, for instance, we don't even have 1 drop of vaccine in Nigeria as I'm talking. Talk of Nigeria is even well to do. What about the West Bloc? Togo is there, Benin Republic is there, we have Guinea Republic, we have Mali, we have those, and they have nothing, neither. So what can we do to help them? Not only in terms of giving them vaccine, but education, enlightenment, knowing that they are part of the world group, and to influence the city's development for the future, for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Timothy, I really appreciate that, especially because I do think, highlighting the fact that the global South, the global North need to talk to each other. There's this real, these walls that come up between these different groups, right? And so yes. I think one of the fundamental struggles I see is how people from different groups with different priorities are communicating with each other and trying to work out how to take hold of one big pot of resources, right? And again, yes. the global kind of political environment is so crucial, I think, to how we make space and how we make healthy environments. And so I'm actually curious of how this links to Chelen and George's presentation in particular, because I'm curious, how did you guys see the US cities, which we know are well-funded and well-connected, but yet our federated system, our government, and our kind of the psychosocial dialogues going on in our communities are leading to really diverse opinions about how shapes should be how spaces should be shaped. How did you guys find the different cities were able to implement these on the fly or very rapid reprogrammings of their streets? And I guess this would also link to another question that we have from our audience, which asks us to consider, again, the healthy streets in the US, but how also these strategies might be implemented in other areas in South Africa, Pakistan, and Nigeria, or not at all. So maybe Chelen and George, you might talk a little bit about what were some of the resources, what was the mechanism that these cities used to create this? What were they drawing from?
I think a lot of what we presented in the show that we did in the PowerPoint was information that we got both locally and we saw nationally. And I kind of want to divert slightly because I wanted to speak up to something that Melinda brought up, which is the use of the commons, and also addresses something that Anna and Timothy talked about, and that these are solutions that were right for maybe mid-sized to larger US cities, but it's not new information. This idea of expanding the commons and using slow streets and common street space for the common good is happening all over. I was recently in Kailesha near South Africa, near Cape Town in South Africa, and a lot of these lessons that we're learning now for our mid-sized cities in the US, they're already doing there, having street spaces that convert during the day to stores and pharmacies and food spaces is already happening. And it's interesting to see this knowledge that we're gaining is we're all gaining it in a different way, and we're making use of it as we can. But it's interesting how this extends to all people, just in different ways.
Yeah, so Chelen, as the co-presenter, what were your thoughts on just the differences between the cities? Because again, I think one of the things I'm also curious about is dispelling the one size fits all, or that maybe these ideas can be perfectly exportable to other places. So what was some of the nuance? What were some of the nuances that you noticed with the different cities?
I think, the differences were in comparison among some of the cities that we looked into, that some of them were more conscious about what already people are doing or asking for. So they observed, I mean, the officials particularly, they observed what people are doing, how they're using the spaces during, particularly when there was lockdowns, and the usage of some of the public spaces around at least the home environment that people were still allowed to have access to. And also, again, cities actually started to listen, not just to observe, but also listen what really people want. So I think that's what made the difference, that some of the simple solutions emerge organically from people's behaviors, changing, evolving behaviors, and cities started to apply it. And some of the cities, again, maybe it might relate to because they are resourceful, they have been able to, carry it over now to figure out actually much longer term solutions after, COVID is over, hopefully too. So I would say, I mean, it has been more about really how the communication has been happening between people and the governing agencies.
Yeah, I hope we learn from this and can move forward with what we've learned.
So I want to hand this over to Caitlin and Mohammed. I see them popping up in my window. And I just want to thank you everyone for bearing with us for our extra 4 minutes. You're very generous. And I just really want to be so appreciative of this panel. And so I leave it up to you. I'm handing over the
Thank you so much. Just want to echo the gratitude today, first to all of our attendees, both here in Zoom and on YouTube, for joining us today and for really fantastic questions. Also want to give just a really big thank you to all of our presenters and our moderators for your fantastic work, your generous time commitment to bring this together and for these timely and important conversations that you've all started today. I also just know that we are all logging in a different time and space, and I know that this has been a long day for many of you, so just want to say thank you for that. To everyone, just want to remind you all that materials from today's session will be available on our YouTube channel, so please head there and you can check out recordings from today as well as from our previous seminars, symposia. So with that, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. This concludes our webinar, so bye-bye to all attendees.